Good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank Chairman Grassley for allowing Senator Hawley and myself to co-chair this hearing designed to examine the failures of the Biden administration's Operation Allies Welcome Parole Program. After the disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan in 2021 that led to Kabul falling to the Taliban, the Biden administration carried out a haphazard evacuation and parole of more than 70,000 Afghan nationals into the United States. And we'll talk more about the importance of parole and its unique meaning within the immigration laws. But many of the 70,000 Afghan nationals that were paroled in the United States were unvetted and allowed to travel throughout the United States even when we had derogatory information or concerns about them. On November the 26th, we'll remember that one of these Afghan nationals, a man named Ramanullah, I'm going to butcher his name, Khanwal, carried out an ambush-style shooting against our National Guard service members here in the nation's capital. One of them was killed, Sarah Beckstrom. This tragic incident first lays bare the obvious question: how did this murderer come to be let in the United States in the first place? And secondly, how do we know that there are no other such Afghan nationals in the United States who might carry out another similar attack? To answer these questions, let's take a brief walk back in history to the 9/11 World Trade Center attacks in 2001. In 2004, the 9/11 Commission issued its final report noting that America remains at risk due to gaps in our nation's overall security apparatus, especially with regard to the vetting of foreign nationals, as well as information sharing and communications amongst the top law enforcement agencies and the intel community. Since 2001, many improvements have been made, but America remains at risk. During his first administration, President Trump heeded the recommendations of the 9/11 Commission and imposed enhanced vetting requirements on aliens seeking to enter the United States. But enhanced vetting for aliens and increased coordination between government entities to assess an individual's risk to the United States yields little results if a subsequent president and administration deliberately choose to ignore these effective measures. President Biden made this choice the moment he took office in 2021. He revoked each and every one of President Trump's executive orders and proclamations requiring enhanced vetting of aliens. Similarly, President Biden revoked an assessment of the security apparatuses of countries around the globe who had nationals seeking to enter the United States. But the bigger blunder came in April of 2021 when President Biden charged ahead with the announcement that the United States would withdraw from Afghanistan by 9/11/2021. During his first administration, President Trump created a strategy for an effective drawdown in Afghanistan based on input from military leaders on the ground. President Biden chose to ignore that strategy, presumably to land another rebuke of President Trump's policies or to make a political point. Whether President Biden rushed forward with full knowledge and deliberation or was wholly unaware of what was orchestrated by his staff under him is a question best left for another day and another hearing. But one thing's clear: responsibility for the failures with the withdrawal and evacuation from Afghanistan lies squarely at the feet of the Biden administration. Not one of the agencies during his tenure in office were prepared for the speed with which Kabul fell, nor were they ready for the volume of Afghans who had rushed to the embassy and airport seeking to leave Afghanistan. Neither the Biden State Department, the Department of Defense, nor the Department of Homeland Security had a proper plan in place. They didn't have enough information on the number of people who needed to be evacuated, let alone who most of these people were, especially if they were not directly associated with the embassy. There was no real guidance, policies or procedures in place, and as noted in one report, the agencies essentially made up policies and procedures on the fly, essentially on an ad hoc basis. One Deputy Inspector General stated informally, that he believed the bombing at Abbey Gate on August 26, 2021, which killed 13 service members, was a direct result of the lack of coordination and failure to have the right information about the anticipated volume of people who would be coming or who would be considered vulnerable and in need of evacuation. Let me say that again. A Deputy Inspector General said the bombing at Abbey Gate on August the 26th, 2021, which killed 13 American service members, was a direct result of the failures of the Biden administration. The airlift from Afghanistan was the largest in U.S. history. The DoD, Department of Defense, moved more than 120 Afghan nationals out of Afghanistan in 17 days. One of these nationals were taken to transit. Once these nationals were taken to transit sites outside of Afghanistan, known as lily pads in Qatar, Bahrain, UAE, Kuwait, Italy, and Germany, the department generally only had between 10 to 14 days to transport them from those countries to the United States. The speed and lack of coordination of the withdrawal was far from the only problem. The process by which massive numbers of these foreign nationals was vetted and brought to the United States was also filled with flaws. Let me turn to Operation Allies Welcome. The young man who committed this heinous attack against our National Guard service members on November the 26th was not the recipient of a congressionally passed special immigrant visa program. Rather, he entered the country through Operation Allies Welcome parole program. You heard me use that term before, and I'll use it again. Under this parole program that was created, or this parole program was created as an end run around Congress. And the Biden administration in the process let in tens of thousands of unvetted Afghans into the country. These individuals had no honorable military service or sacrifice that warranted special treatment. In fact, most of them had no immigration status at all, which is why they were admitted under this authority known as parole. Now, when we talk about parole, it's not what most of us think about in the criminal law context. It's where folks are, under U.S. immigration law, parole is somewhat like an easy pass, like speeding through a toll booth. If we consider the definition of the word, it becomes clear just how foolish the Biden administration's actions were. The U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Service defines the word parole as a discretionary decision to allow inadmissible aliens who are not admitted to the United States to be physically present in the United States. Or to put it more succinctly, parole is a form of entry specifically for people who might otherwise be inadmissible. We can put these definitions together in this chart. In other words, parole authorizes the Department of Homeland Security Secretary to allow people in our country who otherwise would not be allowed in. This discretionary immigration authority was only supposed to be used on a case-by-case basis for exceedingly rare and extreme circumstances. Under Operation Allies Welcome, President Biden essentially gave an easy pass to hundreds of thousands of aliens who otherwise were not eligible to come, or who were not eligible to come, but for this discretionary issuance of parole. The Biden administration used parole to allow aliens into the country who were virtually unknown, except for the information they provided to us about themselves. One thing that struck me after I received several briefings on this parole program was how the security vetting process was often based on information that was not accurate, and in many cases was either incomplete, missing, or completely fabricated. In other situations, agencies relied on records that were inaccurate, incomplete, or missing critical biographic data like the person's name or date of birth. One State Department Inspector General audit highlighted a Kabul embassy official's comment about the high level of fraud in Afghanistan as compared to other countries. Remember that Afghanistan has been run by a terrorist organization for multiple periods of time throughout its history. Given this fact, and given that this government controls many of the records from that country, can we ever truly rely on any document issued by Afghanistan to confirm that any Afghan national is who they claim to be? Even more disturbing were the findings from the Department of Homeland Security Inspector General that some Afghan parolees made it into the United States even though they had not actually completed their vetting protocols. At least 1,300 Afghan nationals were allowed to travel and enter the United States before we even collected their biometrics, fingerprints, photograph, in order to run background checks through the various government databases. At the end of the day, the Biden administration allowed more than 70,000 Afghan nationals into the United States using this claimed parole authority. And once these folks were here, the agencies simply lost track of them. To date, we still haven't located many of the Afghan parolees who were resettled into over the 176 communities across the United States. But thankfully, now that President Trump is back in office, he's prioritized vetting of all aliens outside the country and currently inside the country, including parolees. According to the Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, and the National Counterterrorism Center Director Kent, more than 70,000 Afghan parolees President Biden allowed into the country through Operation Allies Welcome, 18,000 of them were known or suspected terrorists. The NCTC has identified 2,000 individuals with ties to terrorist organizations and is actively working with the FBI on their cases. So clearly, more needs to be done. We need to codify, that is, put into law, the policies and procedures that we know are needed to ensure that America has an effective security apparatus and vetting process outside and inside the United States. Until that happens, we can't give the American public a 100% guarantee, which they're entitled to, that another attack will not occur. Americans deserve to live free from fear that individuals with ties to terrorist organizations are not roaming about our country. We cannot bring back U.S. Army Specialist Sarah Beckstrom, but we can and will do everything in our power to prevent such a horrible incident from occurring again. That accountability starts today with this hearing. I'm looking forward to hearing from our witnesses this morning. And at this point, let me yield to Senator Hawley for his opening statement as the co-chair of the hearing, and then I'll recognize Senator Padilla and Senator Durbin.
Thank you very much, Senator Cornyn, and thank you for holding this hearing. It's a timely hearing on a vital matter. I will just say that what happened in the waning days of the Afghanistan operation and the Biden administration's disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan, I think is now well documented. The fact that there was no vetting that was properly done, there were no interviews that were conducted that were standard, the normal background checks were waived. I mean, heck, as I think we'll see today in just a little bit when we hear from our witnesses, from the inspectors general and others, the standard vetting procedures that have been in place for operations like this were completely disregarded. And we're living now with the consequences of that. Tens of thousands of people admitted into this country. We have no idea of their actual background. We have no idea of their potential terrorist connections. And in many cases, we now have no idea where they are or what they're doing, who they're connected with, or what they're capable of. Sadly, we've seen what some of them are capable of in the horrific shootings that occurred here in the nation's capital just a short while ago with the guardsmen that Senator Cornyn recognized and mentioned. But I think we're going to hear more to even this story today. And here is the additional information, the shocking information that I think that we will find. That this Congress, which appropriated $1.5 billion for this operation on the part of then President Biden, the admittance of all of these refugees and parolees, their supposed supervision, $1.5 billion Of that money, tens of millions of dollars went to pro-terrorist organizations in this country that were supposed to help monitor these refugees and move them along the parole system, but in fact took the money and did who knows what with it. This is a story that we have seen unfold before our very eyes in Minnesota as we sit here today, and now we're going to find that it happened in this case, in this instances, in multiple states, tens of millions of taxpayer dollars going to organizations that support Hamas, that support terrorism, that have praised the attacks of October the 7th, that have consistently defended, apologized for, and justified terrorist attacks around the nation, around the world, that got money from our own government in order to participate in this boondoggle. And I think we need an accounting of where that money has gone to. I think we need an accounting of how it has been spent. And I think, frankly, we need to get it back. And I hope that today's hearing will begin to shed light on what has happened, the corruption that is still going on, the tens of millions or more of taxpayer dollars that have been misspent, misappropriated, misallocated, and misused. And I would just say I think it's long past time for some accountability. I hope we'll take a step forward in that today. Thank you, Senator Cornyn.
Senator Padilla.
Good afternoon, and thank you all for being here. Thank you, Senator Cornyn, for convening this important and sadly timely discussion. So I want to be clear. The violence that unfolded just blocks from the White House was heartbreaking. 2 members of the West Virginia National Guard who signed up to serve our country were targeted in our nation's capital. And I think I speak for all of us, both sides of the aisle here, when I say our hearts are with the families of Staff Sergeant Andrew Wolf and the family of Specialist Sarah Beckstrom. And we continue to pray for Staff Sergeant Wolf's recovery. I am heartened to hear the progress that he's making. But the response to their horrific ambush shouldn't be to attack one another or to seek to further divide our country. It should be one where we come together and double down on the values that make our country truly great. Values of service, of community, of diversity, and opportunity. Instead, we're seeing from members of the Trump administration and even some of my colleagues here in the Senate, there's a response that's truly repulsive. They're exploiting a tragedy for political gain, even when it means turning their backs on many of the Afghan allies who saved American lives overseas. Now, in preparing for today, my office has heard from veterans who have shared stories of the heroism and solidarity of many Afghans who served alongside them, and asked that we not condemn the many for the inexcusable act of one person. And I know there's a number of veterans here in the audience today. Could the veterans and the battle buddies in the audience please stand for a moment? Thank you. And I thank you, we thank you for your service and for being here today to support the allies who stood shoulder to shoulder with all American service members. So today, let's set the record straight about what's really happening. Across the nearly 200,000 who resettled in America, each and every Afghan refugee had to complete multiple rounds of extensive vetting. That's fact. Vetting not just before entering our country, but even after they arrived. Now, I'm not going to sit here and say that the withdrawal of our forces and evacuation of our allies was perfect, but under incredibly difficult circumstances, the United States government came together to respond so that we would not leave our allies behind. This effort involved numerous agencies from the intelligence community, the State Department, Health and Human Services, the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, including Customs and Border Protection. Together, they set up vetting at the military bases where people were sent before being allowed to come to the United States. And here's something that my Republican colleagues won't tell you. If someone didn't pass vetting there, they did not leave those bases to enter the United States. We also know that vetting took place at safe haven military bases here in the United States, and that's all before the vetting that takes place when someone goes through the immigration system with the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. And in the case of the CIA's so-called zero-unit fighters, the vetting went even further because Afghans were vetted by our intelligence community before they even joined the unit. So to suggest that Afghan refugees aren't vetted thoroughly is a pure fabrication to fit a tragic act of violence into a false narrative by this administration. And sure enough, in the case of the shooter from last fall, it's clear that this was not a failure of vetting. It was a failure of counterterrorism, with professionals diverted from their critical missions to instead carry out mass deportations. And it was a failure to support a veteran by pulling back resources that normally support the resettlement process. So let me be more specific about this case. Reports indicate that long before November 26th, Mr. Withdrawal was displaying an alarming change in behavior. This is public. He was isolating himself for long periods in a dark bedroom, retreating from his English classes, his job, his family, only leaving to set out on long solo road trips. A family member of his reached out to the authorities to request a move for Mr. Withdrawal, citing his isolation and fear for his safety after being assaulted and requiring hospital care. Mr. Withdrawal reportedly even reached out to a CIA-run group chat for zero-unit veterans asking for help, but went unanswered. So the combined failure of counterterrorism teams to see and intervene on these clear red flags, and the failure of a system that dodged away Mr. Withdrawal's access to case management and mental health support absolutely contributed to the horrific tragedy that unfolded in our nation's capital just before Thanksgiving. The investigation into the shooting is obviously ongoing, and it would be irresponsible for us today to speculate about motive or cause, but we can't say for certain that it did not occur because Mr. Withdrawal was not vetted. But I also want to make one other point as I close. For nearly 2 decades, American service members relied on our Afghan allies in some of the most dangerous situations imaginable. On the battlefield, as interpreters, and as members of the CIA's zero units. So let's make no mistake, they too are veterans of America's war in Afghanistan. And I want to take a moment to thank the chairman of the Immigration Subcommittee for his past consistent support for Afghan SIV recipients, not only welcoming them to Texas, but by joining me in introducing and passing a bill to speed up the immigration process for Afghan interpreters, urging us all to, quote, make sure these heroes are able to efficiently immigrate to the United States to start a new life. I couldn't agree more. The idea that today we would punish all Afghan allies, or all immigrants for that matter, for the sins of one is outrageous. But sadly, that's exactly what's happening. And I urge you all to reject that kind of scapegoating and cynical politics at this sensitive moment for our nation. Thank you.
Since the ranking member mentioned me by name or identified me as such, I would reiterate the fact that the shooter in West Virginia and tens of thousands of others did not come in through any congressionally passed legislation, but rather through this claimed parole authority, which we will hear more about in a moment. And that is significant. And I would just say, finally, that all of us were misled by the Biden administration that they would protect the safety of the American people first and foremost by properly vetting every alien that was admitted into the country. Obviously, they misrepresented that to us. We relied upon it, and I guess you could say shame on us for believing the Biden administration would actually do their job. Unfortunately, I neglected to recognize the chairman of the full committee, without whom this hearing would not be possible, so I will turn to him and ask him if he has an opening statement he'd like to make.
I was told I was supposed to go after Senator Durbin.
Well, I'm the chairman of the Immigration Subcommittee, and I'll say who goes next, but if you want to defer to Senator Durbin, then I'll respect that decision. Very good. Thank you. Senator Durbin.
Thank you, Chairman Hawley, Chairman Cornyn. I want to acknowledge, as others already have, the veterans who are here today and all veterans who served our country so well. This hearing was scheduled in the aftermath of a horrific tragedy on November 26 when a gunman ambushed 2 National Guard members here in Washington. I offer my deepest condolences to the family of Specialist Sarah Beckstrom, who lost her life in that attack, and I'm keeping Staff Sergeant Andrew Wolf in my thoughts and prayers, as I'm sure many are. At the outset, I want to note my disappointment that there are no witnesses here today representing the executive branch agencies that are responsible for vetting immigrants. There are many questions we would ask them. The lead question is obvious. Why did the Trump administration's USCIS grant asylum last year to the shooter just months before this deadly attack? We do have witnesses from several inspector general's offices, but President Trump illegally fired the heads of those 2 offices, and I'm concerned these offices may now be reluctant to criticize Trump administration action. Unfortunately, the administration has used the heinous actions of one person to paint an entire community as a threat to America. 2 days before this tragedy, the administration ordered a review of all refugees who entered the United States under the previous president, requiring a re-interview of nearly 200,000 people. 200,000. After the shooting, the Trump administration announced a flurry of additional measures to crack down on legal immigrants. They halted all asylum decisions and announced a plan to re-examine green cards for immigrants from 39 countries the president has deemed countries of concern, including Afghanistan. The administration also began canceling naturalization interviews and ceremonies based on an individual's country of origin, and they suspended visa and immigration processing for all from Afghanistan. Listen to what Chris Purdy, a veteran who served in Iraq, said about the Trump administration policies, and I quote, "Tragedy should not be used to flatten complex realities, erase years of life-saving work, or cast suspicion on an entire community that stood shoulder to shoulder with the United States in our longest war." Afghan allies are extensively vetted population. They were vetted in Afghanistan before they were hired to work, to stand beside and help protect our troops. They were vetted again when seeking safety in the United States. Sometimes that vetting went on for months and longer. And again after they arrived through a rigorous, recurring process involving multiple federal agencies. These allies served alongside America's service members through 2 decades of war. They risked their lives, and many gave their lives, to support our troops. So what happened to these allies, these friends, those who stood behind us when they needed our support? Let's look to our veterans for that perspective. The Iraq and Afghan Veterans of America conducted a survey of their members last fall. More than 70% of the respondents disagreed with the following statement. Disagreed. Since 2001, the United States government has done enough to support our Afghan allies. It is obvious to those who served that we owe so much more to these allies. When asked about the detention of Afghans who were going through the immigration process, 70% of respondents agreed that the detentions brought them, quote, a deep sense of personal shame or moral injury. They know that we treated them badly. Our service members need to know that when they're in the line of fire and depending on foreign allies to protect their lives, that the United States will stand by those allies after the confrontation. Who will put their lives on the line for our service members in the next war after watching our treatment of Afghan allies who are detained and deported to a country where they can be imprisoned or killed for their work with us. America is better for those service members having returned home, and America is better for their Afghan allies who now call our nation home. It is time for us to stand behind those who put their lives on the line for our service members. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Grassley.
I want to thank Senator Cornyn and Senator Hawley for their leadership in coordinating this joint subcommittee hearing. Today's hearing follows an Afghan national's vile attack on 2 National Guardsmen, which killed Sarah Beckstrom, and Andrew Wolf was critically wounded. We're forever grateful for these guardsmen's bravery and service to our country. In 2024, law enforcement arrested an Afghan national affiliated with ISIS who planned to conduct a terror attack on Election Day. And just days after Sarah Beckstrom and Andrew Wolf were attacked, law enforcement arrested another Afghan national in Texas who posted online threats to bomb and kill Americans. The last administration failed to enforce our immigration laws and to appropriately vet Afghans that they brought to the United States. President Biden and Vice President Harris, after their administration's botched withdrawal from Afghanistan, stood up a massive immigration parole program, Operation Allies Welcome. A staggering 70,000 plus Afghan parolees entered the United States through the program. Immigration parole's intent is careful consideration on an individual case-by-case basis. President Biden and Secretary Mayorkas, however, failed to enforce our immigration laws and granted parole en masse to a large swath of folks at the border and elsewhere, including Afghan evacuees, many of whom didn't even serve alongside U.S. forces in Afghanistan. The Biden-Harris administration invited other Afghans into the United States as a special part of special immigrant visa program. By 2022, some in Congress wanted to create a pathway for permanency for tens of thousands of Afghans, both those issued an SIV as well as those merely paroled into the United States. The scope of these efforts continues to go far beyond those who dutifully served alongside our troops and aided in their mission. Since 2021, I've warned the Biden administration, my congressional colleagues, and the American public about the failure to vet Afghan evacuees. For years, the Biden administration hid known vetting vulnerabilities from the people. The multiple inspector generals released reports detailing the Biden-Harris administration's stark vetting failures. Initially, the Biden administration failed to vet evacuees against all available Defense Department tactical data prior to being paroled. But even if all the databases were searched, there's arguably never be a full vetting. The Afghan government, national and local, isn't known to be the most organized and diligent with records and intelligence work product. If our government database don't possess all known security risk of individuals, running names against the database won't do much good. Last year, on September the 9th, DHS Secretary Noem told my office that as of August 12th, 2025, thousands of Operation Allies Welcome parolees were potential national security risks. Clearly, problems persist in our own backyard. More recently, on January 7th of this year, I wrote to the Department of Justice, FBI, Department of Homeland Security, State Department, CIA, and the Department of Defense. In that letter, I made public new records. Those records show that the Biden State Department had recommended a special visa, immigration visa for Afghan nationals charged with shooting the 2 National Guardsmen. According to the Biden State Department, the terrorists posed no threat to national security, quote unquote. Last year, I also brought the U.S. CIS and the FBI personnel for bipartisan briefing as part of my oversight. The briefings further discussed the inherent failure in the vetting system of the previous administration. The American people deserve to know the information that the members heard during these hearings, and I've asked the FBI to declassify certain information. Still today, some proposals ask Congress to simply rubber stamp these abuses of parole. Instead of using more proper pathways like refugee admission program, the Biden-Harris administration took drastic shortcuts, and America is less safe as a result. Carving out exceptions, pushing poorly vetted parolees to the front of the line is not the answer. Addressing the executive branch's prior abuses of parole is. That's why I've reintroduced my Immigration Parole Reform Act this Congress. Similarly, recent proposals to expand the SIV program to do little to address the thousands already here who weren't adequately vetted. Thankfully, President Trump's swift work to protect the American people and vet those coming here or intending to remain is welcome course of correction. I look forward to this hearing on what happened, what went wrong, and how this administration can address this issue moving ahead. Again, I thank my 2 chairmen, subcommittee chairmen, for their work on this hearing.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
Before I turn to the witnesses, I'd ask that Senator Coons be allowed to make brief opening remarks. There's been 3 Republican opening statements. A 3rd Democratic statement is in order. This committee's always practiced parity.
Well, Senator Coons is more than welcome to use his time to make any statement he wishes to make. We've had 2 opening statements per side, and then the chairman, who, without whose assistance this hearing would not be possible, was of course allowed to make an opening statement, but we need to proceed with the hearing. At this time, I'd ask unanimous consent to introduce the following 2 documents.
Mr. Chairman.
If you'll wait until I make my request. I ask unanimous consent to introduce the following documents into the record: a December 3, 2025 by press release from the Department of Homeland Security titled "Miles from Nation's Capital, ICE Arrests ISIS-K Afghan Terrorist Who Was Released into the U.S. under Biden's Operation Allies." Secondly, a December 4, 2025 DHS press release titled "ICE Arrests Illegal Aliens from Afghanistan into Our Country by the Biden Administration." And finally, a January 14, 2026 statement from Mike Ho, co-president and director of Federal Relations for Numbers USA, outlining the danger to Americans' national security and public safety when the Biden administration released unvetted Afghan nationals into the United States through parole, and listing some of the Afghan nationals who attempted to commit terrorist attacks on U.S. soil, as well as other criminal Afghan nationals. Without objection, those will be admitted as part of the record. Yes, sir.
Mr. Chairman, if I could also enter into the record a number of letters.
Please.
I would like to submit for the record a letter from Afghan Evac, an organization that's helped thousands of Afghans who directly supported U.S. troops to get to safety. I also have in my hands letters from 1,200 SIV holders who work directly with our troops in Afghanistan, a letter from hundreds of Afghans stranded in Qatar, a letter from 200 members of the Afghan Air Force, a letter from a retired U.S. Air Force captain. Each of these are a testament to the harm this administration's current policies are causing to those who served alongside us. Just this past week, I had a chance to sit with an Afghan who spent 8 years fighting alongside our special forces as an EOD tech. someone who has resettled into the United States, who is working, who has been granted asylum, and he and his wife are terrified that he will be picked up and forced to return to face the Taliban, who didn't just threaten his life, but have murdered a member of his immediate family as retribution for his brave and dedicated service. He saved the lives of 2 American soldiers in a firefight. We should not turn our backs on folks like this who stood with us. I'll close. As Afghan EVAC has said, there is no greater threat to the future of U.S. military operations than the perception that America abandons its partners once the shooting stops. I believe the Taliban is cheering what is happening today, and those who are being forced back to Afghanistan, I think, will be an enduring stain in our nation. Thank you, Mr.
Question,
Chair.
of course, is where does the public safety of American citizens, where does that fit into our colleagues' analysis here? Of course, allies who assisted us, who are properly vetted, who are not a threat to public safety, are welcome into our country. We do want our allies to work with us in future conflicts, but to let tens of thousands of people into the country unvetted, many of whom did not serve with our United States military, is just flat irresponsible and puts public safety of the American citizens at risk. That, for us, this side of the aisle, is a non-negotiable requirement. At this time, I want to introduce our witnesses.
Mr. Chairman,
First
did
is
you
Avern
consent to have
Baker,
those admitted?
senior official performing the duties of Inspector General for the U.S. Department of State. I want to thank Mr. Baker, who's currently serving as the senior official performing the duties of Inspector General at the State Department. He leads a global workforce whose mission is to prevent and detect waste, fraud, and abuse and mismanagement, and to promote efficiency and in the programs and operations of the department and in the U.S. Agency for Global Media. A seasoned senior executive with more than 2 decades of oversight experience, Mr. Baker previously led more than 80 inspections and evaluations, improving the efficiency of department operations while identifying hundreds of millions of dollars of findings with monetary benefit to American taxpayers. Before this current position, Mr. Baker was the Assistant Inspector General for Inspections, where he led the OIG's worldwide program to conduct independent assessment of overseas posts, spearheading efforts to streamline the inspection process through data automation, risk analysis, and dynamic planning to address emerging oversight challenges in Ukraine, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Israel. Craig Adelman is the Deputy Inspector for Audits of the Office of Inspector General for the Department of Homeland Security. In this role, he helps oversee the audit functions of the DHS Office of Inspector General, which conducts independent performance and financial audits of DHS programs and operations to improve efficiency, effectiveness, and accountability. Before becoming Deputy IG for Audits, Mr. Adelman worked as a senior program analyst for DHS, conducting performance audits on information management and related issues. Finally, Mr. Michael Rourke, on April 1, 2019, the Department of Defense Inspector General completed a reorganization of its evaluation components. Intelligence and special program assessments, policy and oversight, and special plans and operations were merged into the evaluations component. Mr. Rourke was named as the Deputy Inspector General for this new component. Mr. Rourke has served with the Department of Defense as Inspector General since June 2000 in a variety of staff and leadership positions, becoming a member of the Senior Executive Service on September the 21st, 2014. Mr. Rourke obtained his undergraduate degree in business from Virginia Tech and his master's in policy management from Georgetown University. In 2004, he completed a detail assignment to the Iraq Coalition Provisional Authority Inspector General. Thank you all for appearing here today. If you'd please rise so I can administer the oath.
Mr. Chair, as they rise, do you confirm the ability for Senator Coons to enter into the record the documents you referenced?
If you raise your right hand and repeat after me, I state your name. Do solemnly swear that I will tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help me God. And all the witnesses said yes. I'm sorry, was there additional records?
The documents referenced by Senator Coons, are those entered into the
Certainly,
record?
without objection. I beg your
Thank you.
pardon. Let me turn to Senator Hawley to begin our questioning. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you very much, Senator Cornyn. Thanks to all the witnesses for being here. Mr. Adelman, if I could just start with you. You are the Deputy Inspector General for the agency charged with overseeing the Afghan Parolee Program. Is that correct?
That's correct.
In 2022, your office found that President Biden's DHS allowed some Afghans into the country before they were fully vetted, including, if I remember correctly, one who had been liberated from prison by the Taliban. Do I have that correct?
That's correct.
I think we're going to see this exhibit maybe over the side of my shoulder here. I just want to read directly from your report. CBP allowed some evacuees to enter into the United States who were not fully vetted. CBP paroled one evacuee into the United States who had been liberated from prison by the Taliban. CBP paroled another evacuee who posed national security concerns. Now, early reports by the inspectors general at DoD and the FBI found that over 50 known or suspected terrorists had entered the United States as a result of the Biden administration's screening or lack thereof. And last month, the director of national intelligence said that 2,000 Afghans in America may have ties to terrorism. That is a very, very big number. So I just want to talk a little bit about how this happened and see if I can get your help in doing that. Let me just start with testimony that this committee, the full committee, the Judiciary Committee, previously received. In 2021, then DHS Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas testified that the administration had a rigorous vetting process in place. I think we've got a quote of his here. We have taken steps, I'm quoting him now, to make sure that the vetting program is indeed rigorous. Now, he said, this may have been in response to a question from me, he said that indeed the vetting did deviate from normal refugee screening. That was an understatement. But he went on to say, we have taken steps to make sure the program is indeed rigorous. So you investigated the vetting process. Did you find that the Biden administration's DHS had a formal vetting process in place that they followed carefully?
Mr. Chairman, before you answer, question for the chairman, are we intentionally bypassing opening statements by the witnesses and going straight to questions?
No, we'll come back to opening statements after Senator Hawley's through.
The department did not have a formal process at the start of the OAW.
Okay, can you just say that one more time?
The department at least could not provide us with a formal screening and vetting process at the start of the OAW process.
The department did not have a formal screening and vetting process in place. The most that the Biden administration did, according to your investigation, was to run Afghans' biometric and biographical information, I think is what you found, like their names and dates of birth and other biographical information they may have supplied. Is that correct? Or that broadly correct?
That's correct until December of 2021 when they began requiring in-person interviews.
So until that time, for the first several months, they were relying on biographical information supplied by the Afghans as well as some biometrics. Now, your office found that that approach was severely flawed, partly because many Afghans did not know their birth dates. Is that correct? Explain this.
That's correct. There was missing information from the OAW population, including first, last names, and date of birth. There was about 11 to 12,000 that did not know their date of birth.
How many, sorry?
Between 11 and 12,000.
11 and 12,000 who did not, which is a cultural thing, I think, but
Correct.
obviously presents an issue for us when doing vetting. So 11 or 12,000 who were admitted for whom we didn't even have their date of birth. That's pretty extraordinary. Let me ask you this. Did the Biden administration require Afghans to show identification at ports of entry?
The department requested identification, but not all Afghans had formal identification, such as a passport. We found over 30,000 that did not have formal identification.
Could you just say that number one more time? How many who didn't have identification?
I believe the number's actually 36,000.
36,000 who could not show identification at a port of entry. Here's a quote from the report. CBP's concepts of operations allowed its officers to admit or parole evacuees into the country without presenting proper identification documents. 36,000 of them. That's astounding. And then my understanding is to do the bare bones background checks that were actually performed, DHS, the Biden DHS, sent a list of Afghans to the Department of Defense and the FBI. That process would normally take months. Would it surprise you to hear that the DOJ's Inspector General found that the list of evacuees was submitted to the FBI via email, and the FBI was given 2 hours to respond?
I can't confirm that. I can just say that there's very limited time to conduct the screening and vetting of those evacuees.
Yeah, here's the quote. It's over my shoulder, I think. DoD and CBP created lists of Afghan refugees which were submitted to the FBI via email with only 2 hours to respond. Let me just ask you finally, I know my time is about expired, just when it comes to interviews, normally refugees, SIV applicants are required to attend an in-person interview. Mr. Edelman, did DHS systematically interview evacuees before they were admitted? Were all the evacuees interviewed?
No,
Did they systematically conduct mental health screenings?
not that I'm aware of.
Well, all of the above should have been done. And the fact that tens of thousands were admitted without so much as an ID, without a birth date, I think it's really no surprise why we are where we are. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Let's go back and allow the witnesses to make an opening statement for further questioning, and Mr. Adelman will recognize you first for that purpose.
Thank you, and good afternoon, Chairman Grassley, Cornyn, Hawley, Ranking Members Padilla and Durbin, and members of the subcommittees. Thank you for inviting me here today to discuss the Department of Homeland Security, Office of Inspector General's critical oversight work of the federal government's efforts to resettle Afghans under Operation Allies Welcome. In the summer of 2021, the United States withdrew military and diplomatic personnel from Afghanistan. The prior administration then launched Operation Allies Refuge, and shortly thereafter directed the Secretary of Homeland Security to lead interagency efforts known as Operation Allies Welcome, or OAW, to help resettle vulnerable Afghan nationals. More than 77,000 Afghan nationals were paroled into the United States through OAW between July 2021 and September 2022. Parole is a discretionary and temporary immigration authority used for urgent humanitarian reasons or significant public benefit. The recent shooting of 2 National Guard members in Washington, D.C., allegedly involving an Afghan national who entered the country through OAW, has sharply focused public attention on how DHS screened and vetted this population. Since 2021, DHS OIG has conducted a series of audits and evaluations in which we identified systemic concerns about the department's ability to carry out one of its most fundamental responsibilities, ensuring that individuals granted parole or temporary protection in the United States are properly screened, vetted, tracked, and monitored. We've issued 7 reports on the subject since 2022, and we continue to examine the department's performance related to OAW. My testimony today focuses on our issued reports, which collectively assess DHS's performance from initial screening and vetting to the ongoing processes for revetting and monitoring individuals over time. Our most consequential audit report on this subject, OIG 2264, examined DHS's ability to screen, vet, and inspect Afghan evacuees. We found that DHS encountered significant obstacles that prevented CBP officers from consistently accessing complete and accurate data when determining evacuees' admissibility and parole eligibility. In many cases, critical information such as full names, dates of birth, and travel document data were missing, incomplete, or unreliable. We also found that CBP permitted at least 35 individuals to travel to the United States without passing both biometric and biographic vetting processes. And DHS did not collect full biometrics for nearly 1,300 individuals before arrival. Further, CBP paroled 2 individuals who were later determined to be national security risks, which resulted in their subsequent apprehension and removal from the country. Our more recent work examined DHS's handling of derogatory information about OAW parolees who remained in the country. We found the department uses a fragmented, siloed process in which no single component has clear ownership of identifying, resolving, and acting on derogatory information. This meant that individuals whose benefit applications were denied due to derogatory information could remain in the United States indefinitely without enforcement consequence. We continued this work in 2024 by examining DHS's oversight of parole expiration across multiple humanitarian programs, including OAW. We found DHS lacked a well-defined process to track the end of parole and did not routinely initiate enforcement actions when an individual's parole expired. As a result, DHS did not have assurance that former parolees were lawfully present in the United States after parole expiration. We've issued 17 recommendations intended to help the department fix these weaknesses. We recommended DHS assign centralized ownership of vetting and derogatory information resolutions and real-time tracking of parole status. Our findings do not assert that better processes could have prevented specific incidents. However, current processes for vetting and tracking individuals who entered the United States as part of OIG are not sufficiently reliable. Our findings have been consistent. DHS was not adequately prepared to manage the scale and complexity of the Afghan evacuee crisis while maintaining strong national security controls. Through our oversight work on this subject, we identified vulnerabilities to the American public if the department cannot properly screen and vet individuals entering the United States, resolve risk indicators, or ensure accurate records. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Mr. Baker.
Good morning, Chairman Cornyn and Hawley, ranking members Padilla and Durbin, and members of the subcommittees. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. First, I want to acknowledge the tragic events that have brought us here. We remain hopeful for Staff Sergeant Wolf's recovery and are encouraged by reports of his progress. Our deepest sympathies go to his family and the family of Specialist Beckstrom, whose life was suddenly and tragically taken. The nation mourns her loss. My remarks will focus on the oversight work of the State Department's Office of Inspector General, particularly our work related to the screening, vetting, and relocation of Afghan nationals. This work spans multiple years and touches on a range of programs and processes. We've issued a total of 11 reports on the screening, vetting, and relocation of Afghans from 2017 to 2024. Afghans have entered the United States through three major pathways: humanitarian parole, refugee status, and the Special Immigrant Visa Program. Our office is focused primarily on the Afghan SIV program, which Congress created in 2019 to resettle Afghans who worked on behalf of the U.S. government. The SIV process included a review of eligibility, a petition phase, and a final visa application. State Department personnel collect applicant biographic and biometric data, submit data for vetting, and conduct in-person interviews. Only after all these steps are complete is a visa issued. Even after a visa is issued, final admission is determined by the Department of Homeland Security at the port of entry. State OIG has identified longstanding challenges with the Afghan SIV program. Prior to the evacuation of Kabul in August 2021, the program faced chronic staffing shortages and relied on outdated technology, factors that contributed to a growing backlog of SIV visas. During the evacuation, State OIG found that the lack of reliable data and inconsistent criteria for identifying at-risk Afghans severely hampered planning and execution. After the evacuation, the State Department experienced an influx of Afghan SIV applications, greatly expanding the existing backlog to almost 155,000 in December 2022. In response, the department increased staffing, deployed new software tools, and expanded interview locations. We also examined how Afghan SIV holders fared after arriving in the United States. State OIG found that the vast majority of Afghan SIV families secured housing and enrolled their children in school within 30 days of arrival. However, employment rates were lower than those of other refugee populations, and resettlement agencies reported persistent challenges in addressing mental health needs, locating affordable housing, and providing language support services. In January 2025, the administration suspended refugee admissions and has not reopened the program to Afghans. In June, the president restricted visa issuance and entry for Afghan nationals except for visas issued under the SIV program. In November of last year, the State Department expanded that suspension to include Afghan SIVs. Looking ahead, several SIV program areas require attention. Leadership gaps, fragmented information systems, and limited coordinations among agencies continue to hinder the program. We also have ongoing investigations into potential fraud and are working closely with other government agencies to ensure accountability. We remain committed to ensuring that our oversight leads to meaningful reforms that protect our national security and honor our promise to those who stood with us. Thank you for the opportunity to testify. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Baker. Mr. Rourke.
Good afternoon, Chairman Cornyn and Hawley, and ranking members Padilla and Durbin, and distinguished members of the subcommittees. Thank you for your inviting me to discuss our previous oversight work on the DoD's supporting role in screening displaced people from Afghanistan. In June 2021, the DoD tasked the Army's National Ground Intelligence Center, or NGIC, to support the Department of State's request for assistance for special immigrant visa applicant processing. Later, beginning in August 2021, the DoD supported the Department of Homeland Security as the lead agency responsible for biometric screening of Afghan evacuees traveling to the U.S. and overseas military locations. DHS's Customs and Border Protection conducted a portion of the biometric enrollments for Afghan evacuees at overseas staging bases and stored its collected information in its IDENT database. The DoD completed the remaining enrollments and screened its information against the DoD Automated Biometric Information System, or ABIS. The DoD OIG issued 21 audit and evaluation reports related to the DoD's support for displaced persons from Afghanistan. Today, I will specifically discuss 2 of those reports on the DoD's supporting role in enrolling and screening those displaced persons. In our first report from February 2022, we determined that the National Counterterrorism Center was not using all DoD data to vet Afghan evacuees prior to their arrival in the U.S. Specifically, the NCTC did not have access to some DoD biometric and contextual data in the ABIS database, such as tactical operations debriefings and reports or fingerprints from improvised explosive devices, or access to intelligence databases used by the DoD on a classified network. This occurred because CBP enrollments were forwarded to the NCTC by the National Targeting Center for vetting purposes and were compared against the DHS IDENT data, which did not initially include all biometric data in the DoD ABIS database. In addition, the Army's Ground Intelligence Center had agreements with foreign partners that prohibited sharing some ABIS data with U.S. agencies outside the DoD. In August of 2021, because all Afghan evacuees were not being screened with all available data in the DoD's ABIS database, the Army's Ground Intelligence Center took it upon themselves to expand their analytic review of Afghan evacuees. By September of 2021, the NGIC had identified 31 Afghans with derogatory information from DoD databases who were already in the U.S. By November of 2021, NGIC had identified 50 Afghans in the U.S. with potential significant security concerns. NGIC developed informal procedures to notify both the DoD and interagency stakeholders about these individuals. As a result, the U.S. faced potential security risks if individuals with derogatory information or security concerns were allowed to stay in the country. In addition, the U.S. government could mistakenly grant SIV or parolee status to ineligible Afghan evacuees with these concerns. One of our 2 recommendations remains unimplemented, specifically that the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence and Security develop procedures for sharing derogatory information on Afghan evacuees with the DoD and interagency stakeholders. Our second report from June 2023 determined that DoD personnel supported other agencies' requests for screening Afghan evacuees by conducting biometric enrollments of approximately 2/3 of all Afghan evacuees at the intermediate staging bases overseas, and conducting follow-up counterintelligence screening interviews of Afghans who were identified as a match to the DoD biometric watch list. In addition, the Army's NGIC analysts conducted biometric assessments of all watch list encounters and biographic analysis of more than 84,000 Afghan evacuees' records, and sent out rapid notifications to a wide distribution list to identify evacuees who may pose a threat to national security. However, in our report, we did note that the NGIC did not consistently follow its guidance and procedures when deciding to retain or remove some Afghan evacuees from the biometric watch list. As a result, NGIC may have removed some Afghan identities from the BULE, which is the other name for the biometric watch list, that should have been retained on the list. This is important because the DHS used the biometric watch list as one consideration for its screening and vetting analysis to determine whether Afghan evacuees should be allowed to travel to the U.S. Of our 8 recommendations, 1 remains unimplemented. Specifically, that the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence should revise or replace DoD policy to reflect the transition of responsibilities for the management, support, and requirements of the DoD biometric watch list. This concludes my statement, and I would be happy to answer any questions you have.
Thank you. Senator Durbin.
Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a letter from then Senator Rubio and Senator Warner to President Biden asking him to ensure the safety and security of Afghans who work closely with our intelligence agencies and partners.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to ask a general question here. I'm sure each of you have reviewed a lot of evidence and made recommendations as inspectors general do. Did any of you make the recommendation for the policy we currently have, which stops the processing of all immigrant and visa applications for individuals with an Afghan passport?
I think I'll go ahead and take that question, Senator, since the State Department is primary responsibility for issuing visas and immigrant visas. I'll say in our position as the Inspectors General, we do not make policy decisions, the agency does, and this is a policy decision that the agency, rather than we would.
The others have anything to add to that? Mr. Edelman?
No, I agree with his assessment.
Mr. Rourke?
I agree.
So here's my dilemma, or my challenge, and I think it's been noted this afternoon. I sat through, I don't know how long it was, Senator Cornyn, but we had a period of time in the SCIF with classified and secret information trying to get to the bottom of this. It's a serious, serious situation involving the loss of life and serious injury, and we're trying to figure out what went wrong. What did we do that was wrong? And the thing that kept recurring to me was the fact that the individual, the shooter involved with the National Guardsman, had been identified as a person with problems, serious problems. Mr. Edelman, well, for all three of you, this man accused in the tragic shooting of 2 National Guard members, we've not seen any indication there was a failure in actual vetting. Instead, there was a failure to respond to urgent requests made by his family members and volunteers about deteriorating mental health. Mr. Baker, you made reference to that already. Isn't this a real gap in the process that we can go through and check the boxes one after the other, and miss the obvious problem that could have led to saving the life of this National Guardsman and the one who was injured?
I can't talk to the assessment of the particular individual. Overall, I would say that the interview that's conducted when someone applies for benefits would be an opportunity to get to know the person and see if there's any challenges there.
But these are over a period of time, as I recall. This isn't day after day. Could be a matter of days, weeks, maybe even longer between interviews. And in this situation, we understand the shooter, his material situation, his physical situation at home was deteriorating, and he was showing this bizarre conduct, driving all over the United States, making statements that worried even his family. How could we miss something like that? That seems to me to be getting to the heart of whether or not this person is safe in this country or safe for others.
We have looked at the continuous monitoring of individuals who remain on parole. We found that DHS continues to do a poor job of sharing information between their different components, whether it be CBP, USCIS, and ICE, and did not have agreement on what type of guidelines would lead to enforcement action during our reporting process.
And I might say that we're talking about an agency which has diverted massive resources now to a totally unrelated undertaking involving the city of Chicago and the city of Minneapolis and other places. Mr. Baker, what's your impression as you consider this gap in asking the very basic questions of what's wrong with this man?
I can't, like my colleagues, speak to the individual case, but I can go back to the work that we've done. The State Department was responsible for the first, I believe, 30 to 90 days of resettlement activities, which included providing services to evacuees pending a transition to the Department of Health and Human Services, which carried that forward. Our work did find significant challenges with mental health support and screening, in part because the evacuation occurred during COVID, in part because of difficulties finding medical professionals with language skills that would be sufficient to work with the Afghan population. Furthermore, the State Department's role was only for 90 days for this program when the transition to HHS occurred. I would say that that was a finding and a concern that we had in terms of mental health support in the work that my office has done.
So I run out of time here, and I'm sorry, Mr. Workey, couldn't give you a few additional seconds. But it gets down to the bottom line. Have we learned anything from this horrible experience, this tragedy? I mean, there's a lot of finger pointing that goes on Capitol Hill by both political parties. Is this Joe Biden's fault? Is this Donald Trump's fault? Who made the last decision and so forth? Wouldn't it be better for us to take a lesson from this about how we can improve this process in the future rather than just shutting down any access of asylees into the United States from 39 different countries? I would like to see us do something positive and bipartisan and really make this a safer system. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Do any of the witnesses disagree with the statement that a prerequisite, a non-negotiable requirement of any of these programs, whether it's the Special Immigrant Visa Program or the parole program, should be the safety and security of the American people? Anybody disagree with that? Mr. Baker, in 2024, your office issued a report stating that the Department of State could not confirm the number of individuals evacuated from Afghanistan. Is that correct?
That is correct, sir.
What we do know is about 80,000 of these individuals, this unknown total of individuals evacuated, that 80,000 of them were paroled into the United States. Mr. Adelman, you mentioned the fact that parole, this authority of the executive branch to allow people to enter the country who would otherwise be inadmissible, is supposed to be decided on a case-by-case basis, correct?
Correct.
And would you agree with me that the categorical issuance of parole, whether it's to the Afghan nationals or to the millions of people the Biden administration let come across the southern border, is an abuse of that authority given to the executive branch? In other words, it's not on an individual basis, right?
Each individual who entered parole through parole was inspected by CBP, and ultimately that process leads to the parole of that individual. I can't speak to whether the grouping of individuals is against the policy.
Well, when you're letting tens of thousands of people into the country, whether it's across the southern border or from Afghanistan, and you're not doing it on an individual basis, then that, according to your testimony, which should be done on an individual basis, is not being done. Would it be fair to say, Mr. Baker, that the level of vetting required under the Special Immigrant Visa Program that you testified about, that Senator Padilla mentioned, that vetting process was far more stringent than what was required by the Biden administration for Afghan parolees?
Senator, yes, I think I would agree with that. However, I would caveat it by saying we have not looked at or have oversight responsibilities for the parole program to compare and contrast.
Mr. Baker, if you could sort of set the scene for us. So we don't know how many people were evacuated from Afghanistan. All of us, the image of people trying to jump on the C, I guess it was a C-130, coming out of Afghanistan, out of Kabul, will be forever burned in our memory. But we don't know how many people were ultimately evacuated. We do know that the Biden administration is granted parole outside of the Special Immigrant Visa Program to about 80,000 individuals. But how in the world can you properly vet an individual if they don't know their date of birth? I mean, the fact is, Afghanistan has been a war-torn country for a long time. And basically the Taliban a terrorist organization, allowed Al-Qaeda a foothold in Afghanistan. And obviously, we know how that turned out on 9/11/2001. But is there any surprise to you, Mr. Baker, that not only we don't know when many of these people were born, that we actually don't have any records whatsoever, one way or another, about these individuals?
I think our work has shown, Senator, there is in fact a high level of identity fraud in Afghanistan for documents. And with respect to the Special Immigrant Visa Program, which I can speak to more directly, there were significant staffing gaps at the embassy. About a third of the consular positions were vacant prior to the evacuation.
Yeah, I believe you mentioned that earlier.
Yep.
Do we know where these people are? The 80,000 people paroled by the Biden administration, the Afghan nationals, Mr. Adelman?
A number of them applied for immigration benefits.
Do we know where 80,000 of them are?
I can't confirm that we would know where 80,000 are. I would defer to the
Do we know
department.
what they're doing?
I would defer to the department who does the monitoring.
Does the United States government know whether any other Afghan nationals admitted by use of this claimed parole authority have become radicalized?
I would defer to the NCTC and the department.
And while we're focused on the untimely death of this National Guardsman and the assault against her compatriot, we have no idea whether there will be future attacks against the American people or plots like the one that was stopped by the FBI and shortly thereafter in Fort Worth, or how many of them were radicalized, have become since radicalized since they are in the United States. So I'll finish where I started. It is a non-negotiable requirement, a prerequisite, that whatever visa program, whatever parole that any president might grant to foreign nationals, that first and foremost, we have to be concerned about the safety and security of the American people. Everything else is secondary. And that's what this hearing is about.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I actually agree with the importance of several of the questions that you're asking, and it's only underscoring that the appropriate administration witnesses are not here for today's hearing. Look, my colleagues on the right want to make this tragic incident about a failure of screening and vetting. The alleged shooter from just before Thanksgiving, Romanella Lachenwall, was part of a unit that the CIA has publicly admitted to working with. So I think we begin with asking ourselves, are we really going to sit here and say that this man wasn't vetted by the CIA many, many steps ago in the flow chart? As for the evacuation of Afghanistan, I mean, I think there's no question that mistakes were made during the evacuation. We're having parallel conversations here. One, the incident, the alleged shooter specifically, and then the other, more program, policy, the vetting background more holistically. And on that point, fortunately, we don't have to guess what went right or what went wrong. There's nearly 50 separate Inspector General reports that have examined Operations Allies Welcome and the Special Immigrant Visa Program. Thank you. And they analyzed this from every angle, including over 24 reports from the 3 departments represented here today through their Inspector Generals. And since the majority appears eager to relitigate this operation, Mr. Chairman, I ask that we place these reports in the hearing record without objection. Thank you. I also want to note that yet again, the hearing has moved forward without the appropriate government witnesses to answer some of the questions that have come up. But let me specify this, because this is public information. The vetting processes that the alleged shooter went through from when he began working with the CIA, I've made that point already, to when his asylum application was granted by the current Trump administration. Yes, that's right. The asylum application that was granted by the current Trump administration. The administration representatives to answer questions about that aren't here. But let me ask about the screening and vetting of the people who are here as witnesses. Mr. Adelman, the Department of Homeland Security Inspector General reports make clear that your audits compared the parole screening and vetting processes to the Special Immigrant Visa Program and U.S. refugee processing, and that the Operation Allies Welcome parole screening included biometric and biographic screening at lily pad locations, plus manifest vetting and CBP inspection at ports of entry. Can you briefly walk us through the layered process so the public understands what screening and vetting meant in practice?
Yes, thank you. CBP and DoD collected both, as you mentioned, biographic and biometric, including facial images and fingerprints. While the evacuees were at the lily pads, they matched that information against government databases throughout the federal government. Once a decision was made when they were allowed to travel to the United States, CBP put together a manifest for each flight. They did another round of vetting of that manifest, and then they were allowed to fly over into the United States. At that point, they went through the normal inspection process that everyone would go through when they reach a U.S. port of entry, which is the inspection process run by CBP. If CBP found something, they would take them to secondary, or expected to.
Thank you. And just quickly, would you agree that your reports ultimately found that these processes were indeed followed, yes or no?
Generally speaking, the vast majority it was followed. The challenge was the
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Brown, from the perspective of the Department of State, do you agree as well that these processes were followed, yes or no?
Senator, we reviewed 112 SIV files in the context of our audit, looking at steps required to protect national security, and found that all State Department required steps were conducted in the sample for SIVs that we
Thank you very much. And Mr. Chair, in my limited time, I do want to ask a question on an important and related matter. We spent a lot of time today talking about the screening and vetting in a program that has been repeatedly evaluated by offices of inspectors general. Documents are right here, including those represented today. What I haven't heard today is any concern for screening and vetting in what I would call a hastily concocted program, President Trump's so-called, quote-unquote, gold card. Unsurprisingly, there's limited information available on the Gold Card website and even on the USCIS website. Mr. Edelman, today you testified about concerns about screening and vetting in two programs that put people through background checks multiple times over the course of years. The Trump Gold Card website answers a question of, quote, how long will the process take? And the answer
I'm sorry, Senator, your time is
once an applicant's processing fee and application are received. Mr. Chairman, you went over your time. I appreciate 30 more seconds.
Well, that's the prerogative of the chair is to recognize
interview. Do you plan
senators
to look
to
into the
speak,
screening and vetting process
addressing an
for this
unrelated
Gold
topic,
Card program if it only takes
you're
weeks,
out of order.
only if the price is right?
Senator
Let the
Britt's
witness answer,
recognized.
please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Chair Hawley. I appreciate you holding this hearing, and the witnesses, I appreciate you being here today. Look, the Biden-Harris disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan sent shockwaves not just through that region, but literally across the entire globe. I was not in this body at that time. I was actually on the campaign trail. And there is nowhere that I visited in the state of Alabama where people didn't have a visceral reaction to the lack of our commander-in-chief being in command. We know that that travesty was just further elevated by the fact that we failed in the vetting process. And today we're here to get answers about what actually happened and how we can make sure that this doesn't happen in the future. So that's what I want to focus on. I have heard a lot of conversation about what went right or what went wrong, what should have happened, where we failed, where we didn't have the proper procedures. So let's talk about that. One of the things I saw in, I think it was September of 2022, Mr. Adelman, DHS OIG released a report that stated that CBP admitted the following evacuees to the U.S. under OAW, and it was 417 evacuees whose name was totally unknown. There were 242 evacuees whose last name was unknown, 11,110 evacuees whose date of birth was January 1st. And it goes on and on and on. And despite this, the Biden-Harris administration and DHS did not concur with the recommendations of DHS OIG that you all made to address it and to actually ensure it didn't happen again. One of those recommendations was from DHS to develop a comprehensive contingency plan to adequately vet and screen all individuals during future similar emergency situations. So do you know, Mr. Adelman, if any of the steps have been taken to ensure that the years to re-examine and implement, these different recommendations, has that been taken, and where are we on that?
Thank you, Senator. For that one recommendation on lessons learned, the department, as you noted, did not agree and has not made any progress in completing that recommendation. We have closed a second recommendation in that report on the recurrent vetting process.
So wait, put a pin in that for a second. Do either of you know of any changes or structural processes that have been improved upon the failures that we have seen in the past?
I can go back to a point a moment ago. We in State OIG have an open recommendation on the department for memorializing arrangements for the collection, tracking, analysis, and sharing of evacuee data to update the memorandum of agreement between the department and state.
Has that happened, though?
It has not. That recommendation is open, so.
Still?
Yes.
Still?
So.
After we saw the travesty that occurred a few weeks ago, the loss of life, still? Okay, do you have anything?
Yes, in our 2 reports on screening and vetting, we made a total of 10 recommendations, and 8 of those have been closed. So taking the point that you made earlier about what can we learn from this and how can we improve in the future, I think the department has taken action within about 6 to 8 months of both of our reports to close 8 of the recommendations.
Okay, well, I appreciate that, and we have a limited amount of time. Mr. Adelman, will you just tell me some of those recommendations that were made under the previous administration that we could be working on right now to try to kind of, that were obviously rejected, that we need to put back in front of people right now?
So the additional recommendations really looked at after the evacuees were admitted into the United States, focused on who is responsible for tracking the end of parole within DHS. The components, CBP, USCIS, and ICE, all could not agree on who is responsible. They also focused on better sharing of derogatory information within DHS and improving data quality issues. We found a large number of data inaccuracies in DHS's information.
Well, in my remaining minute, I know that the Trump administration has talked about refocusing on where we are now, finding these individuals, making sure that we're doing a better job. But based on your experience in dealing with these issues, are there any particular unresolved issues? Obviously, the administration can push, but that we here in Congress need to take a look at in order to be able to be better positioned in the event that this happens in the future?
I think for me, it would be just to make some progress on the recommendations to clarify the responsibilities within the Department of Homeland Security and improve information sharing.
Okay, Mr. Baker?
Could you repeat the question? I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
and I have 10 seconds real quick. Mr. Rourke, do you have anything?
Yes, I think for DoD, if the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence and Security can implement the 2 remaining open recommendations, I think that would go a long way to improving this in the future.
All right, well, let's get to work. Let's work together to make sure that we keep the American people safe.
Senator Coons.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the witnesses for your testimony. Specialist Sarah Beckstrom should be alive today, and Staff Sergeant Andrew Wolf should not be fighting horrific injuries, and they and their families are in my prayers. One man, Mr. Lankenwall, did a horrible, tragic thing. That does not mean all of those of his same background deserve to be punished. Instead, we should, as several of my colleagues have suggested, have a real conversation about how we ensure this doesn't happen again. And that has to include mental health resources, access to local law enforcement. Could you 3 each just briefly answer, is there any specific flag or piece of information that your clear DOD missed about Mr. Lankenwall as he was being reviewed for admission to this country that can be attributed to the broader issues or potential deficiencies in vetting discussed in your various reports?
We didn't look at the specific individual, and I don't want to comment on him now because of the open investigation.
Understood. Mr. Baker?
Really the same.
Mr. Rourke?
So DoD has a lot of information and data that we compiled over 20 years in Afghanistan. And I think the question for us to look at was how best can we get that information into the hands of decision makers? And so that's why we focused in our two reports on the macro issues and kind of how we can deal with that risk and identify improvements that can be made.
So look, I'd appreciate more follow-up from you on that, but here's what I just heard from the three of you. We're not here at a hearing where you looked at this tragic case and this individual and then looked back at the raft of previous reports and your work to say this is the failure in vetting or this is the process issue that led to this individual being in the United States. I think it's apparent we need to have a serious conversation about Mr. Lankenwald's case, his mental health struggles, how we could identify and ensure that a similar threat is stopped before a tragedy strikes. But I do disagree with the way this hearing was framed, both in its title and I think its overall objective to justify the demonization of the Afghan people, and in particular, those who served alongside our troops and came here through the post-conflict relocation. Deputy Inspector General Adelman, I've been really concerned with the impact of the Trump administration's cuts to public safety and counterterrorism grant programs to states. I've been concerned with its reassignment of thousands of law enforcement personnel to support mass deportations of individuals without criminal records. Both of these, in my view, have harmed public safety and taken resources away from the very local law enforcement efforts that might have prevented this specific attack. Are you conducting any inquiries into the effects that these cuts and reassignments have had on DHS's ability to address current or future threats to the homeland?
Normally in our work, we would wait till the grants are paid out before we would take a look at them. I understand this situation creates a different issue, so it's something that we can take under consideration.
I mean, there were additional mental health grants cut today. There were law enforcement related grants cut last year. My hope is that you will do some of that work and then come back to the chairs of these subcommittees to discuss it. A last question for you, if I might, Mr. Edelman. Your 2022 report, OIG 2264, its first recommendation required providing evidence of full screening and vetting of all Afghan evacuees and ensuring that recurrent vetting processes were established. Your testimony says you closed that recommendation. Can you say more about how or why that recommendation was closed?
Yes, CBP provided us with data to illustrate that the recurrent vetting process was created and followed. They also showed that they had obtained additional information potentially through when someone's applying for immigration benefits. We are doing follow-up work to look at the current recurrent vetting process and if things have improved in terms of information sharing.
I look forward to hearing about your new study about the recurrent vetting process, and I welcome that analysis. But let me just make sure I heard you right. That first recommendation required evidence of full screening and vetting and ensuring that recurrent vetting processes were established, and you closed that recommendation.
That's correct.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Coons, I will repudiate the characterization of this hearing as a demonization of the Afghan people. This hearing is about President Biden's administration's failure to keep the American people safe. That's what this hearing's about. Senator Cruz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In August of 2021, Joe Biden and the Democrats presided over the most disastrous American retreat in modern times. In Afghanistan, we saw chaos. We saw Bagram Air Base abandoned to the Taliban. We saw Afghans clinging to the wheels as planes took off. And we saw 13 American servicemen and women murdered. It was utter disaster, and the subsequent evacuation was both over-inclusive and under-inclusive. It was under-inclusive in that we left behind Afghans who had risked their lives supporting the U.S. military, and it was over-inclusive in that the Biden administration did, at best, half-assed vetting that put the American people in danger. In a span of just a few days, the Biden administration carried out the largest importation of foreigners in American history, bringing more than 120,000 people, including tens of thousands of unvetted Afghans, into the United States. Mr. Baker, you're the acting inspector general at the State Department. Approximately how many Afghan nationals were ultimately brought to the United States?
Senator, according to visa statistics, about 145,000 visas and U.S. Refugee Admission Program admissions occurred. Secretary Blinken identified 124,000 evacuees out of Kabul as the number. However, we were never able to verify that number despite 8 months of work with Department of Defense OIG colleagues.
And your office found serious breakdowns in coordination, record keeping, and accountability, correct?
Absolutely, yes.
And most of those individuals were admitted through mass parole, not through fully vetted visas. Is that correct?
That I can speak to the State Department piece of that, and I believe I don't have the numbers for my colleague.
77,000 were paroled into the United States.
And the numbers are stark. Of the 77,000 you just mentioned, more than 70,000 had no prior lawful immigration status and were paroled into this country. Mr. Adelman, you're the Deputy Inspector General of Audits for the Department of Homeland Security. Your office has documented that the vetting process for this population was rushed, fragmented, and incomplete. Is that correct?
Correct.
Because of that rushed process, terrorism-related indicators and derogatory intelligence were not fully resolved prior to entry. Is that correct?
We identified 2 individuals who it turned out had derogatory information and later had to be removed from the United States due to national security concerns.
According to intelligence assessments, approximately 2,000 of these evacuees had terrorism-related ties or derogatory intelligence indications. Because the vetting was rushed and fragmented, those indicators were not fully resolved before entry. And worse, there was no systematic, sustained follow-up after entry to determine who actually posed a threat. Even so, with only cursory post-entry review, law enforcement has already identified at least 55 Afghan evacuees who were confirmed or suspected terrorists. 55. Mr. Adelman, these 55 individuals were not uncovered through a comprehensive screening system. They were identified despite the absence of one. Is that fair to say?
I can't speak to the 55, but I can say that there were challenges in the screening and vetting process.
So if only cursory scrutiny uncovered 55 confirmed or suspected terrorists, isn't it reasonable to conclude that additional risks may have gone undetected among the remaining population?
That was our concern.
And the gravest danger wasn't limited just to those we managed to identify. On November 26th, just blocks away from the White House, an Afghan national paroled into the United States by Joe Biden opened fire on National Guard service members standing watch over our Capitol. 20-year-old Guardsman Sarah Beckstrom was shot and killed at her post. Guardsman Andrew Wolf was critically wounded, and the most chilling truth is this: the November 26th Afghan attacker in Washington, D.C. was not among the 2,000 individuals flagged by intelligence assessments. He was not among the 55 confirmed or suspected terrorists. We have young Americans in uniform doing their duty who should not have been shot and should not have died. For years, we've been sounding the alarm, and for years, the Biden administration looked the other way and endangered every American in this country.
Senator Blumenthal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think I speak for all the members of this panel in expressing the view that violence is absolutely abhorrent and unacceptable, that our hearts go out to the family of Army Specialist Sarah Beckstrom, and we pray for the quick recovery of Staff Sergeant Andrew Wolf. My hope is that we honor them with action, that we look forward and say to ourselves, how can we stop this kind of violence from happening again? What we know about the shooter's mental health is that apparently had been declining for some time. And individuals familiar with him raised the alarm over episodes of depression and erratic behavior. There's speculation that his prior roles in combat, because he was at the side of our troops as part of a CIA-backed Zero unit in Afghanistan, might have contributed to PTSD in the same way that our own troops come home with that kind of illness. It is an illness, a disease. It is treatable, but it has to be addressed. So the topic here is framed as one of vetting and perceived failures of vetting, but it also should be viewed as one of mental health and even of gun violence. Mental health is not an Afghan problem, it's an American problem. And Mr. Edelman, do you know how the shooter obtained the gun?
We have not looked into any records of the suspect.
Do you know whether mental health services were available to him?
I do not.
Do you know whether IG reports have been conducted to examine levels of PTSD that refugees or others coming into this country after thorough vetting may be suffering from?
We have not looked at that in the past.
Let me ask you on another topic. A lot of talk today about screening and vetting. I haven't heard anything, again, looking forward, about the so-called gold card, President Trump's gold card. My understanding is, from the limited information that's available on the gold card website, that, and actually I'll quote from it, once an applicant's processing fee and application are received, the process should take weeks. Now, we're talking about vetting and screening of someone who came into the country after multiple series of vettings over years. Do you have any plans to look into this process of vetting and screening that allows somebody to come into the country after only weeks, possibly of superficial, very little vetting, simply because they can pay money to expedite the process?
So we take a risk-based approach when we choose what audits to look at. As we learn more about this, we will certainly take that under consideration and determine.
Well, I'm asking you for a commitment, sir, that you will, in fact, look into the gold card process to prevent this kind of problem from recurring. In real time, we see the potential pitfalls. Will you look into them to prevent the kind of absolutely abhorrent consequences that we saw in the death of these two great National Guardsmen?
Yes, we'll look into it as part of our planning process, yes.
I was a critic of the Afghanistan withdrawal in the way that it was done. I'm not here to relitigate that issue. I'm here to look forward and try to prevent this kind of tragedy from occurring again. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I just have one last question before we excuse this panel. But given what you described in that the difficulty of getting information from a war-torn country, one that had been involved in war for 20 years or more, given the fact the Taliban, a terrorist organization, basically was in control or governing the country, given the fact of illiteracy on the part of many of the Afghan nationals who couldn't even state the date of their birth, do you agree with me that the default position of this Operation Allies Welcome was, unless we find something derogatory, you're going to be admitted. In other words, no record was treated as a positive in terms of admission. Is that, you agree with that characterization, Mr. Adelman?
I do.
Thank you. You have anything else for this panel?
Yes, Senator, I also would agree. I would point to some of our work on SAVs where I note we have a high refusal rate for those who go through a thorough process. It does indicate, again, document fraud and other risks with those applicant pools.
Thank you. I'm sorry I didn't see Senator Moody come in, but I'll recognize her next, and I understand Senator Blackburn is right here, too. Please proceed.
First of all, I want to say thank you that you all are here. And I thank the chairman for calling a joint hearing that we could work through this. I think there are so many questions that have arisen out of this parolee program and the hurt that it has caused, the uncertainty that it has caused has not been something that would credit our nation's processes and policies. Fraud, let's talk about that. And Mr. Alderman, I want to come to you with this. This is something that we have heard so much about. Of course, the White House has had quite a focus on this, and with what has happened in Minnesota, that has really caused people to look at some of these programs. I introduced the Fraud Accountability Act this month, and it is something that would make fraud a deportable offense and would actually update the INA to make certain that it is it's explicit. Now, you're serving as the Deputy Inspector General in the DHS Office of Audits. So I want you to talk for a minute about what you are seeing with fraud, how you see if it is widespread, and how you respond to what the steps that this administration, unlike the last administration, this administration is taking steps to root it out.
Thank you. We've done extensive work on COVID relief fraud. In our office, we had a group that was or is directly focused on that, and we found many challenges with fraud through the COVID funding that was received by states. We also look at FEMA grants to ensure that those are spent correctly and have a large number of reports on that, and we will continue to do that type of work to ensure that anytime the department is spending its funds, that there is not fraud involved or wasted funds. I would need to review the changes that would be made. Plus, I wouldn't really look at the policy of changes to the INA in my position, but I can say that we continue to look to make sure to root out fraud with the department spending.
Where are you seeing the most prevalent entry points for people that are committing fraud? Is it through a lack of vetting in these programs, or where's that entry point?
I think there's always a balance when there's an emergency on how quickly you want to quickly provide funds for those people who have faced something terrible. But when you're speeding through those, and sometimes there's something called self-certification where they're saying, I need the funds, that's where it can become a challenge.
Okay. Mr. Baker, let's talk about vetting, and the committee has talked quite a bit about that as you've been in this hearing today. And I think there is no doubt that the lack of vetting is something that has just caused so much concern. And one of the things that I hear in Tennessee is that as people are reviewing these programs, they're not necessarily talking about it as a national security issue. They talk about it as a public safety issue. And we have referenced the situation here in D.C. with Sarah Beckstrom and with Staff Sergeant Wolf and the tragedy that is there. But talk about how you see this lining up with those public safety concerns rising.
Senator, thank you for that good question. I think we in state OIG do view visa and consular integrity as a matter of national security and not just public safety. It's integral to the work that we do, and our work with the Special Immigrant Visa Program has included an integrity working group with DHS, U.S. Customs and Immigration Service, and Bureau of Diplomatic Security, which has concurrent jurisdiction for visa and passport fraud from the beginning. We have a number of ongoing cases, as I mentioned earlier, related to the SIV program, and we are very much seized with the importance of this part of the portfolio for our oversight role.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Whitehouse.
Thanks, Chairman. May I first ask if any of the witnesses on this panel served in Afghanistan?
I did not.
No.
No?
I traveled there as a civilian to do my OIG oversight work.
Okay. The reason I asked that question is because I think one important voice for a hearing like this is the men and women who served in Afghanistan and who worked closely with Afghan soldiers and intelligence operatives, very often very closely, very often with their security determined by the capability of their Afghan colleagues. And when the issue of Afghan resettlement came up, the voices that I heard the most were the voices of Rhode Islanders who had served in Afghanistan, other Americans who had served in Afghanistan, and whose message to us was, many of us owe our lives to these Afghan soldiers. We have a moral duty to protect them and to give them an opportunity to come to the United States and not leave them to the tender mercies of the Taliban. Do any of you disagree that the service of Afghan troops and intelligence professionals gave them some moral standing in an effort to relocate to the United States?
No.
Mr. Edelman does not disagree with that? Is that no, no, and no? No. Well, I happen to agree with you, and I wish that voice was more prevalent here. I've also been told, and if anybody cares to correct me in a response for the record, you're welcome to do so, but I've been told that the number of Afghans who have entered on parole into the United States under Operation Allies Welcome is 76,000. And that of those 76,000, as of a report from the Department of Homeland Security in December, 6 had been arrested. 76,000 brought into the United States, 6 have been arrested. By my count, more January 6th rioters pardoned by President Trump were arrested after the pardon than our Afghan allies brought into this country under Operation Allies Welcome. So I hope as we go forward, we consider what our obligation was to those Afghan soldiers and intelligence operatives, translators, IED technicians who served beside our troops, often protected them sometimes at the cost of injury and loss of life to themselves, particularly where the numbers, I can't do the math off the top of my head, but 6 out of 76,000 getting arrested, that's like less than 0.1%. We're not exactly dealing with this dangerous intrusion into our country when those are the actual numbers. So I wanted to make those points because I think a hearing like this should reflect the views of the Americans who served in all the different stages of our activities in Afghanistan from those earliest days when our special forces teams went in and charged around on horseback in the mountains, only able to operate because of the support of Afghan allies, all the way through until the departure from Afghanistan that was driven by a very unfortunate agreement entered into by President Trump.
Senator Moody?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is an important hearing. I think anytime we can show the American people that we are thoroughly investigating and providing oversight when there has been harm in America to Americans, especially those that have volunteered to serve, we need to show that we're doing everything we can to make sure we mitigate the chance of it ever happening again. And so I appreciate all three of you being here today so that we can perform this critical review, this critical function of government on behalf of the American people. And unfortunately, we continue to find example after example where failures of the last administration come to light. I mean, I, as a former Attorney General, discovered numerous examples where laws were being broken, reckless decisions were being made during the last administration, got courts to find that laws were being broken, reckless decisions were being made. And unfortunately, we still had the same activity go on and on and on, and watching the horrific results of those decisions and policies play out on our TVs every night. And so I think it is incredibly important as a nation that we, the people, demand that we get back to proper governance and that we examine what went wrong and how we ensure it doesn't happen again. So the tragedy that we witnessed right before Thanksgiving, the tragic killing of a National Guardsman and the critical wounding of another at the hands of a foreign national, the American people deserve answers. Tragedies like this are becoming all too familiar, and I can name the names, and the Americans across the nation can name these by heart now: Laken Riley, Nathaniel Barker, Sarah Beckstrom. Their families now grapple with the reality that they will be missing loved ones. And time again, under Biden's leadership, non-citizens, heck, even entire foreign nations were prioritized over American citizens. And that shameful withdrawal from Afghanistan, the way that went down, reminded Americans of that fact. In fact, I bet everyone in this room sitting here today remembers exactly what they were doing when they watched that debacle, that tragedy play out. I polled everybody in my office this morning. Do each of you remember when you saw that happen? It played out on TVs. Do you remember what you were doing? Every single one of them remembered it because it was such a devastating embarrassment to our nation and certainly a morale blow to the men and women that served over there. Not only did they allow millions and millions of illegal aliens to flow across our southern border and then pushed so many of those that were unvetted into our neighborhoods, they granted entry to thousands of barely vetted Afghan nationals at the expense of American citizens. You know, you don't have to just take my word for it. Hunter Biden just said last month that the Afghanistan withdrawal was an obvious failure. And I think he used profanity with that, but the position remains, and it may be the only thing we agree on, that the last president, President Biden, failed the American people, and President Trump is trying his best to fix it, and now Congress has to act to make sure that these fixes stick and that we don't find ourselves in this position again. And so, Mr. Baker, I thank you for your service to our country. Under President Trump, we have stopped treating border security and vetting like best practice suggestions, and we've started treating them like the core national security responsibilities that they are. Can you share with us or identify any enhanced Trump-era special immigrant visa screening practices or controls that made that program more secure and reliable, which we should codify or focus on so that these cannot be bypassed in the future during a time of crisis?
Senator, thank you for that question. My office has not done work. As you may know, the Afghan SIV program has been suspended. However, we do have 4 recommendations outstanding with the department if that program is to be restarted that will strengthen SIV processing. And again, I'm speaking to SIVs and not to what my colleagues would be handling with humanitarian parole. One particular area we saw from the very beginning was the lack of strategic planning, that is, of setting goals and measuring them systematically. Policies for ongoing interagency coordination and improvements, a second recommendation, and employment verification MOU with DoD. And finally, staffing plans. So we have 4 recommendations, and I know my colleagues and the other OIGs do too, that if implemented will strengthen the program, and I trust Congress can consider in that context.
I see I have used all of my time, so I will defer back to the chair. Thank you so much.
I want to thank all of our witnesses for being here today and for your service to our country. We are going to move now to the next panel. And thank you again for being here.
No problem. Okay.
Thank you all for being here and being so patient during the first panel. We're looking forward to hearing from you. I'll introduce 3 of our witnesses, and Senator Padilla will introduce the other 2, and then we'd like to hear your opening statement. Simon Hankinson is a senior research fellow at the Heritage Foundation. From 1999 to 2022, he was a foreign service officer serving in multiple locations around the world. Prior to his work as a Foreign Service officer, Mr. Hankinson worked as a lawyer in London and then taught history, English, and drama at a private school in Miami. Mr. Hankinson holds a master's degree in modern history from St. Andrews, Scotland, a degree from the College of Law in London, and a master's degree in international security affairs from the National Defense University. Nayla Rush. Dr. Rush is a senior researcher for the Center for Immigration Studies, focusing on refugees and asylum policy. She holds a PhD in migration studies from the University of Sussex in the UK, a maîtrise in sociology from Sorbonne University in Paris, excuse my pronunciation, and a BA in sociology from the American University of Beirut. Dr. Rush is an expert in global issues relating to international migration, analyzing migration's impact on the social, cultural, and economic dynamics of societies. Julie Marzuk, did I get that correct? Marzuk. Julie Marzuk is a lawyer, an author, and a strategic problem solver with experience in legal advocacy, policy analysis, and nonprofit coalitions. She's directed nonprofit law firms and served as a clinical law professor. Evolve Advocacy Consulting partners with funders, community institutions, and policy leaders to design and execute high-impact legal, regulatory, and narrative strategies that defend Jewish civil rights and strengthen democratic norms. I'll turn to Senator Padilla to introduce our remaining witnesses, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm pleased to welcome and briefly introduce the minority's witnesses, beginning with Mr. Nadim Yousefi. Mr. Yousefi's life is defined by a guiding principle of selfless service. Born in Afghanistan, he stood shoulder to shoulder with United States forces as an interpreter from 2010 to 2015, putting himself and his family at great personal risk. After being approved for a special immigrant visa in 2015 and moving to the United States, he chose to enlist in the United States Marine Corps as an infantry rifleman re-entering active duty, this time wearing an American uniform. Mr. Yousefi went on to complete his 2 deployments, first with the 11th Marine Expeditionary Unit and another with the Special Purpose Marine Air Ground Task Force Crisis Response. Today, Mr. Yousefi is a nursing student and a U.S. citizen with aspirations to commission as an officer in the Army Nurse Corps following graduation. Remarkably, he also makes time to also be involved in his community and to give back. Since 2021, Mr. Yousefi has been assisting other resettled Afghans navigate the many aspects of building a stable, successful life here in the United States. His love of his adopted country, his Afghan heritage, and an exemplary record of service to the United States have instilled in him a unique combination of service, loyalty, and generous spirit. And he brings to this conversation a depth and breadth of firsthand knowledge that only comes from a life as devoted to our country as his. And I thank him for being here. It's also my pleasure to introduce our second witness, Mr. Perry Blackburn, a retired lieutenant colonel who served as U.S. Armed Special Forces officer. He was one of the first Americans on the ground in Afghanistan after September 11th. He's the founder and CEO of AFG Free, an organization he founded to keep the promise to get Afghan partners out of Afghanistan safely. Through his organization, he's helped evacuate thousands of U.S. citizens and allies from Afghanistan. Lieutenant Colonel Blackburn, thank you for your service and for coming to testify before us today.
Thank you to each of the witnesses for being here. Mr. Hankinson, we'll start with you for a 5-minute opening, please.
Chairman Cornyn, Ranking Member Padilla. Let me put the bottom line up front. I'm certain that of the 200,000 Afghans brought here under programs hastily arranged by the Biden administration since 2021, there are hundreds who should be deported. I'm certain that some have criminal or terrorist records that make them inadmissible under our immigration laws. And I believe it's inevitable that members of this population will victimize Americans or other immigrants in future. The U.S. involvement in Afghanistan exactly bookends my career as a Foreign Service officer. From our first casualty, CIA officer Johnny Michael Spann in November 2001, to the final terrorist attack by ISIS-K at Kabul airport 20 years later that killed 13 Americans. I was in my first tour as a political officer in India when we got into Afghanistan. I was in my last tour as Consul General in Nairobi when we left. Through no fault of the many brave and dutiful American men and women who served there, the U.S. presence in Afghanistan did not achieve its desired objective. After 2 decades, thousands of lives lost and billions of tax dollars spent. The end was ignominious. The Afghan government we'd paid billions to prop up fell like a house of cards. Our exit was rushed and chaotic. We brought home our dead and wounded, but we left billions in equipment and supplies for the Taliban. When the Treaty of Paris ended the Revolutionary War, Ben Franklin wrote, "If we do not convince the world that we are a nation to be depended on for fidelity in treaties, if we appear negligent in paying our debts and ungrateful to those who have served and befriended us, our reputation and all the strength it is capable of procuring will be lost." This is true. Yet gratitude to those who have served us doesn't mean bringing every one of them and all of their relatives to the United States. The U.S. had other options. We could have helped to support a safe zone in Afghanistan itself. The country's often had regions run by warlords who oppose the central government. Or instead of paying billions to bring Afghans to an alien country far from home, we could have paid neighboring countries, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Pakistan, or even India, to take them in. These places have more in common with the Afghan culture, religion, and way of life than any Western country. Even if one accepts the premise that those Afghans who have given exceptional service to America should be brought here, the levels of service, and hence the risk, varies greatly between individuals. Yet that distinction seemed to play little part in our mass evacuation effort. We didn't just bring out a few thousand exceptional Afghans for whom their American comrades personally vouched. We evacuated people who happened to make it to the airport at the right time or were lucky enough to get out of the country. We accepted them based on unsubstantiated claims and unproven family relationships. When Americans think of Afghan allies, they think of guides, soldiers, translators, and others who risked their lives beside our forces in the field or in critical national security, combat, and intelligence roles. They're not thinking of laborers working for subcontractors or for foreign media organizations or NGOs. As Afghanistan combat veteran Joe Kent said, vetting a foreigner in a war zone to determine if he will fight a common enemy is vastly different than vetting a foreigner to see if he's suitable to live in our country. And as Marine combat veteran Wade Miller said, separating true friends from other categories of Afghan is not simple. He wrote, "Many played both sides. Many only did it to make money. Many were plants. Many had long-standing tribal grudges against the Taliban." Our efforts to extract a theoretically limited number of Afghan allies using parole, special immigrant visas, or as refugees were poorly targeted. The Biden administration's efforts to bring in as many Afghans as possible, as quickly as possible, resulted in standards being dropped far below the level plausible to keep out dangerous, unstable, or undesirable individuals. The vetting standards were inadequate to accurately determine their identity, biography, and thus national security risk. Afghans brought to the U.S. under Operation Allies Welcome and its successor programs have been arrested for crimes including property damage, sexual assault, plotting terrorist attacks, and murder. At present, the U.S. has no means to vet anyone inside Afghanistan. We have no diplomatic or overt security presence in the country. And until the Trump administration paused all entry for Afghans in 2025, the State Department was still allowing them to apply for special immigrant visas in any other country they could reach. Their applications were processed by local staff with no knowledge of Afghanistan. They were interviewed by consular officers with no experience of Afghanistan. There were no penalties for submitting false applications or for applying more than once under a false identity. Even the best vetting can only find information that is available. The saying in computing goes, garbage in, garbage out. For vetting, the corollary would be nothing in, nothing out. Any record applicable to a given Afghan, but which is unavailable to U.S. agencies, does not count as derogatory information. And even successful vetting cannot predict future radicalization or action. Admitting foreign nationals, however well screened, has inherent risk. Thank you for inviting me to testify today, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you. Colonel Blackburn.
Thank you. Chairman, ranking member, and members of the committee, thank you for this opportunity, and thank you for your service to this country. May God bless all of y'all. I come here as a witness to provide my experiences with Afghanistan and American citizen evacuation. I submit this testimony as an American born abroad to a foreign mother, a son of a soldier, and as a retired soldier myself, who has spent a lifetime at the point where policy and consequence meet. We lost National Guard Specialist Sarah Beckstrom. May God rest her soul. Staff Sergeant Andrew Wolf remains in our prayers as he fights to recover. Their sacrifice deserves remembrance, and it deserves justice. Full justice against the perpetrator and anyone who comes to this country with the intent to do harm. There must be no ambiguity to this point. Violence against American service member is an attack on the nation itself, and it must be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. It is critical, though, that I speak clearly and honestly at this point. The person who perpetrated this crime does not represent the Afghan people I fought beside, not that I advocated for, nor that I continue to support. Conflating lawful allies with violent criminals dishonors both our fallen soldiers and the Afghans who kept faith with us. I served in the United States Army for decades, retiring as a lieutenant colonel after multiple combat tours. I was the first soldiers in Afghanistan and Iraq, and I was proud to be part of it all. Some judge a career by rank or awards. The men I measured success with, we measured it differently. We measured by lives preserved and promises kept. When we arrived in Afghanistan, we were met by a local Afghan partner, a warlord, a U.S. government personnel, and they welcomed our presence, but they also warned us the enemy was everywhere. Nobody was coming to rescue us if things went wrong. This was a Special Forces mission at its core, and it should never have been anything else. People came from all over the world to kill Americans. Let's not forget that. Even Americans came to kill Americans. It was confusing to our Afghan allies. And yet, our partners stood beside us. They fought beside us, and they translated not just language, but culture. They helped us understand tribal dynamics, honor, and consequence. They bled, they died, they lived. They became like us. They cursed like us. They dipped Copenhagen. They tried their best at American jokes. And they believed deeply in that America meant something, that we meant something. Who could not forget that we actually secured polling places so Afghans could vote? The world remembers images of women holding up ink-stained fingers, proving that they voted. Girls went to school. Men worked without fear of reprisal. That progress was not abstract. It was earned, block by block, village by village, firefight by firefight. We did it together. That is why what happened in August 2021 shook me to the core. The world watched Afghans as they clung to aircraft, as we saw Senator Cruz so eloquently display. It was sickening. I felt sick. But we made a promise. We taught our youngest privates to model American values to the Afghan people. What we are, who we are, the promises of loyalty, accountability, and honor as Americans. And then we left. I just couldn't stand by. I put my personal information out on all the social media websites I could and said, if you need help, contact me. I'm not sure what I'm doing yet, but we're gonna do something right. And we did. People from across the globe responded, veterans and civilians. We formed networks overnight to save lives. It quickly became clear that this effort would require resources. So I established a nonprofit, and not 1 cent has ever been provided to me by the U.S. government to my organization. Every dollar came from me and private citizens and veterans. We established strict criteria to advocate for our Afghans. First, we worked to rescue American citizens. I'm proud to say our networks of advocates helped over 2,000 American citizens return home after the fall of Afghanistan. One of them was a woman named Sarah, who had been imprisoned by the Taliban. We freed her and 2 young girls by moving them into Pakistan with the help of our Afghan partners that we still had touch points with in Afghanistan that were willing to do that and still await their disposition. Eventually, we got Sarah back, but not before she told me, I want to stay in Pakistan and help these women. The 2 girls she fought so hard to save remain stranded today. Second, you had to have worked with U.S. personnel, and you had to prove it. Hotak, who was a mechanic, was at the airport. He didn't have the proper paperwork for his youngest daughter. We spoke earlier about birth dates. Birth dates is a cultural thing. It's foreign to us, and it's hard for us to wrap our mind around. They don't really, it's not important to them. What's important to them is their family and their family lineage. He did not have the proper paperwork for his youngest daughter. So believing that they would be reunited shortly in Humanitarian City, he boarded the airplane with his 2 sons. When he arrived in the United States, he immediately went to work because he was not reunited yet. For the first time in his life, he became a single parent raising 2 elementary school-aged children in an unfamiliar country, navigating confusing rules, systems, and unfamiliar laws. What is FICA? He had no idea. For 3 years, he worked, waited, and hoped. And finally, in 2024, he was reunited with his family. Third, you had to meet the State Department's requirements. We wanted you here legally. We did everything we could. They did the processing. We did not sign a single piece of paperwork to help an Afghan. We just sent them to the website. But even with those standards, the system nearly collapsed. 13, and we talked about this earlier, of our finest were killed at HKIA because of an IED attack and leadership failures. Nowhere in our doctrine do we allow the enemy inside of our perimeter. And that moment marked the end of an orderly evacuation. Conflating lawful allies with violent criminals, though, dishonors both our fallen soldiers and the Afghans who kept faith with us. A Marine who later became an advocate, was there during the fall of Kabul and witnessed his interpreter step in front of gunfire to protect him and his unit. He and his men cleared the HKIA runway and stood over Murder Alley, a stretch of dirt road they could see and will never, ever forget. That is the fate of those who we left behind. That is the real life and death consequences of turning our backs on those who risked their lives for our country. This hearing is about the Afghan Parole Program and the CIV program. Programs like this exist because of our credibility. I believe our credibility matters to the world. Because when America makes a promise in war, people do stake their lives on it.
Colonel, if you wouldn't mind wrapping up, because we had 5 minutes per witness, and then give us a chance to ask you some questions and you can further expound on it.
Yes, sir. Thank you. In closing, our soldiers deserve justice, our allies deserve honor, and our nation deserves the truth. Thank you for their time.
Thank you, Colonel. Thank you for your service to our country as well. Ms. Marzouk?
Thank you, Chairman Hawley, Chairman Cornyn, and Ranking Member Padilla, who is my personal senator from California. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today. The testimony that we have heard today rightfully focused on how Afghans were vetted before they arrived in the United States. But the story of what happened after Afghans were paroled into America also deserves scrutiny, as it exposes a serious national security threat. In 2022, the federal administration distributed hundreds of millions of dollars to the states to provide Afghan parolees with immigration legal services. The asylum process vets applicants for terrorist affiliations. Ethical attorneys strengthen the vetting process. Unethical attorneys create vulnerabilities. So where did the Afghan legal service funding go? The answer is haunting. In too many cases, our tax dollars flowed to terrorist affiliates. Let me say this clearly. Federal money went to the Council on American Islamic Relations, or CARE. That's right. We paid an organization with a 30-year association with terrorism to screen parolees for terrorism. CARE masquerades as a Muslim civil rights group, but that's not true. The explicit purpose of CARE's creation was to advance Hamas's agenda in America. This is not my opinion. It is not hyperbole. In 1993, the FBI wiretapped the meeting where CARE was created. This is a matter of public judicial record. In the 2008 Holy Land Foundation trial, the largest terror financing case in U.S. history, CARE was named as an unindicted co-conspirator. When CARE tried to appeal that designation, a federal judge found that the government had produced ample evidence to establish CARE's association with Hamas. After the October 7th, 2023 terrorist attacks in Israel, CARE's leadership rushed to support Hamas. The current National Executive Director of CARE, Nihad Awad, the same person that was at the wiretapped Philadelphia meeting back in 1993, expressed his happiness to see October 7th. Texas and Florida have recently designated CARE as a terrorist organization. The structure of the Afghan funding obscured transparency. Federal dollars flowed from the federal government to the states and then to nonprofits. This structure makes it difficult to track funds. But here's what we do know. CARE took over 90% of the money allocated to California for Afghan legal services. In total, CARE California received more than $15 million of federal money. With all of this money, CARE California helped fewer than half of the asylum applicants that they promised to assist. So either they were very inefficient with federal resources, or that money got routed to other, even more nefarious purposes. CARE received $1 million for Afghan immigration services from the state of Washington. CARE Oklahoma, CARE Florida, and CARE Texas also all provided asylum immigration legal services for arriving Afghans. In its application for funding, CARE California effectively touted its ability to coach clients around being scrutinized for terrorism. I was an immigration attorney for 15 years. I have taught immigration law. How attorneys prepare clients in asylum cases can be determinative. Outsourcing a core national security screening function to an organization with documented extremist associations represents a systemic failure that needs federal oversight. Thank you for your time. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Mr. Yusufi, thank you for your service to our country.
Thank you for your support, Senator. Thank you, Chairman Corian, Chairman Hawley, Ranking Member Durbin, Ranking Member Padilla, and other members of subcommittee for the opportunity to speak with you today. My name is Nadeem Yousafi. I'm a naturalized American citizen, a United States Marine sergeant, a future nurse. I'm hereby today as an example of what successful refugee resettlement and integration looks like when it's grounded in service accountability, commitment to this country. I'm testifying in my personal capacity today, and my views do not represent those of the United States Marine Corps. From 2010 to 2015, I served in Afghanistan as an interpreter in direct support of U.S. Department of Justice Drug Enforcement Administration. I did not simply translate words. I translated intents, warnings, and threats. I help American personnel operate safely in an environment where misunderstanding would cost lives. Working alongside American service members shaped who I am today. I saw their discipline, their professionalism, their willingness to risk everything for one another. I was inspired by that example. My family has a long tradition of military service. After graduating high school, I followed in my older brother's footsteps, and I committed myself to serving alongside Americans we respected so deeply. Because of this work, I became a target for the drug traffickers, Taliban, and other insurgent groups. Like many Afghan allies, my service put my life and my family lives at risk. After years of documented service and extensive vetting, I later migrated to United States through the SIV, or Special Immigration Visa. I want to be very clear about what the process looked like. The SIV process required years of interviews, background investigation, biometric screenings, and continuous repeated reviews by multiple U.S. government agencies. Every detail of my history was examined. It was an obstacle course. Once I arrived to the United States, immediately I enlisted in the U.S. military. I did not pass my ASVAB. I got 18. So I have to go back to school to improve my English and my math in order to get a better ASVAB score and finally enlist in the Marine Corps with a 67 ASVAB. I had 2 deployments back-to-back in my first active duty, and I spoke 4 languages, and I tested all 4 of them for the DoD. Today, I'm a nursing student and inactive reserve status, My goal is to return to active duty and serve as an officer in Army Nurse Corps because I want to continue serving this country and caring for those who do. I hope my children and grandchildren will one day serve as well. When they're dead, they will be buried with American flag on top of their casket. I have also been deeply involved in supporting undersettled Afghan in my community since 2021. I helped navigate families in a new country, find stability, build futures rooted responsibility and contribution. Service did not end when uniform came off. It's the way of life. I understand the concern raised in this hearing. National security matters. Public safety matters. No one who served alongside Americans like I did would ever dispute that. I also acknowledge the tragic incident involving a fellow service member. I lost a sister in arms. Specialist Beckstrom, may her soul rest in peace. I extend my deepest condolences to her family and her unit, and a brother, Staff Sergeant Wolf, who is currently recovering from injuries. Their sacrifice deserves respect and seriousness. But it is essential to separate individual criminal acts from the reality of entire population that was vetted, tested, and proven through the service. Because of their service, many Afghan allies paid deadly price, with estimates of more than 300 interpreters and their family members killed because of their association with the U.S. forces during their service in a targeted attack, afterwards, or while waited for promised SIV visas. Many others were threatened, forced into hiding, or assassinated quietly without headlines. Like any system oversight and improvements are necessary, criminal acts must be addressed swiftly. Accountability must be affirmed and uncompromising, but accountability should be individual, not collective. One person's crime should never erase the sacrifice of 10,000 who stood with the American service members under fire. How we treat...
Please wrap up your opening remarks, please.
I believe in America. I ever lived here. That belief led me to serve as an interpreter, then as a Marine, now as a future nurse. I'm not unique. There are thousands like me who continue to serve quietly every day, and most of them are right behind me, sitting in this hall currently present. Security and compassion are not opposite. Strong vetting and moral responsibility can and must exist together. America is safest when it keeps both its borders and its word. Thank you for your time, Senators.
Thank you very much. Dr. Rush.
Chairman Corrin, Chairman Hawley, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today on this important topic. I began focusing on the Afghan issue in 2021 as U.S. forces withdrew from Afghanistan. Like many Americans, I watched the images of packed aircrafts and the chaos at the Kabul airport. During that summer, around 80,000 Afghan nationals were evacuated by the Biden-Harris administration under a program called Operation Allies Refuge. But despite the program's name, and contrary to the prevailing narrative, the majority of those airlifted and those who followed were not U.S. allies. Most had no connection to the U.S. government, military, or any U.S. contractor or subcontractor. The term allies has indeed been used and misused. The former administration did not stop with the initial evacuation. It went on to create multiple additional pathways for Afghans to enter the United States, ultimately bringing the total number of arrivals to more than 200,000. Most evacuees did not possess visas to be admitted into the U.S., nor were they eligible for special immigrant visas, which are specifically reserved for Afghan allies, or for refugee statuses available to persecuted Afghans. As a result, the administration relied on parole to allow them into the U.S. Immigration parole is an official permission to enter and remain temporarily in the U.S. and should be only granted on a case-by-case basis. The legality of the prior administration's expensive use of parole has been widely questioned. Once processed, parolees were resettled into American communities and were exceptionally granted the same federal benefits as refugees and SIVs, including work authorization, health insurance, cash assistance, housing support, and more. They were also provided federally funded immigration legal services to help them seek asylum or other permanent legal statuses. These benefits were not limited to the 80,000 individuals who were hastily evacuated. Most who had arrived later under Biden's alternate pathways, who are also not our allies or persecuted refugees, were similarly granted parole with the same benefits. All this came at a significant cost to U.S. taxpayers, with estimates reaching up to $14 billion. I want to address the issue of vetting before I conclude. We know of the absence of dependable screening measures for nationals from conflict zones, such as Afghans and Syrians, and of the impossible task of cross-checking backgrounds. But beyond terrorist attack threats on U.S. ground, there are other important implications. A couple of years ago, I wrote about a young Afghan evacuee who was arrested less than 2 months after his arrival for engaging in prohibited sexual contact with a minor and possessing child pornography images. Most of the mitigating circumstances presented by the defense to get leniency at sentencing touched on his cultural difference. According to his lawyer, some sexual conduct that is deemed criminal in the U.S. is considered acceptable in Afghanistan. Even if he was indeed regularly screened, as many who advocate for countless Afghan admissions claim, and all the documents pertaining to his judicial history in Afghanistan were available, he would still have been cleared to enter the U.S. In this young man's case, nothing was missed because there was probably nothing to find. His village in rural Afghanistan does not have a regularized criminal justice system. Disputes there are resolved through inter-family mediation. This case illustrates a broader truth. It is naive and perhaps arrogant to assume that newcomers will automatically leave their beliefs, norms, and biases behind. Which brings us to a fundamental question. If we are not primarily welcoming U.S. allies or persecuted refugees, who exactly are we admitting and why? There are millions of Afghans who are not at risk, but may nonetheless wish to leave their country under Taliban rule. Afghanistan has a population of roughly 38 million people. How many should the United States welcome, and on what basis? Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Rush. I'll recognize Senator Hawley.
Thank you very much, Senator Cornyn. Ms. Marzouk, if I could just start with you. I want to start with something that you said a moment ago in your opening statement and that you also write about in your written testimony, because it's quite striking. You said that millions of dollars went to an organization, millions of taxpayer dollars went to an organization with terrorist ties, supposedly to help screen parolees to make sure they didn't have terrorist ties. So let's just talk a little bit about how this happened. In the fall of 2021, Congress passed and then President Biden signed legislation providing about $1.7 billion in taxpayer funding to help settle for carrying out refugee and entrant assistance activities. That's the language from the statute. And much of that money was then made available to states. Have I got that right?
That's correct.
So we're talking about $1.7 billion originally, tens of millions, hundreds of millions that are available to states that then turn around and give it to grants in the form of grants to nonprofits. Have I got that right?
Exactly.
Now, where this nonprofit money goes is where the story gets interesting. These nonprofit groups are supposed to be helping with the settlement process. Some of them provided legal services to the refugees. Is that correct?
Yes, there was money for resettlement and separate money for legal services.
Got it. So how is it that money, taxpayer money, ends up in the hands of an organization, maybe multiple organizations that have terrorist affiliations? Tell us how this happened.
Well, I think there's plenty of fault to go around. The first should lie with the terrorist-supporting nonprofit that presents itself as a legitimate civil rights organization.
And what would that be?
That's the Council of American Islamic Relations, CARE.
So this is a group that you say has ties to terrorism. Explain why that is.
It's not my opinion. They were an unindicted co-conspirator in the 2008 Holy Land Foundation. And in that trial, the wiretap from the 1993 meeting in which CARE was founded was brought into the federal public record. In that meeting, they specifically state that they are going to present themselves as a legitimate civil rights organization while furthering the mission of Hamas.
So you have an American court proceeding that finds that this entity has direct ties to Hamas, may be part of a Hamas funding network, but yet they're getting money. How much money did they get from the federal government to shepherd Afghan parolees?
It's very hard to track the funding because some state fiscal oversight portals show it more clearly than others. I can say with certainty that in California, they received $15 million. In the state of Washington, they received more than $1 million. And I can say also that an affiliate of CARE, which is called ICNA, the Islamic Center for North America, which has its own documented ties to extremism and terrorism, was also subgranted $1 million.
$15 million in one state, millions in other states going to this entity. Did you say that following October 7th, the leaders of CARE celebrated the Hamas attacks, or did they condemn it? Which was it?
Multiple leaders are on public record celebrating the Hamas attacks. The National Executive Director, the CEO of CARE California, and the Executive Director of San Francisco CARE all publicly celebrated October 7th.
So you've got an organization that was founded in conjunction with Hamas that a federal court has found is linked to the funding network that is somehow getting millions and millions of taxpayer dollars to help Afghan parolees, supposedly to make sure that they're not associated with terrorism. This group's associated with terrorism. Now, when I look at the federal databases to see if there's any reference to CARE, I don't see anything. Why is that? How have they hid the fact they've gotten so much money?
That's correct, Senator, because the money went from Health and Human Services to the states and from the states to nonprofits. In fact, nonprofits could then subgrant further. So the money did not go directly from the federal government to CARE, but rather an intermediary, and that is how they've hidden the money.
It's like a dark money network. Tell me this. Is there any reason to believe that any of the representations that CARE made to the states were false, or did they use false names? Did they use false front organizations? I mean, what do we know?
Absolutely. So in California, the contract between CARE and the state of California for $7.2 million is in the name of CARE of Greater Los Angeles. CARE of Greater LA is not a legal entity. It does not have a federal EIN. It does not file a 990. CARE of California is a legal entity. But since CARE of Greater Los Angeles isn't an entity, there is no way to track that $7.2 million.
There's the cash out. So in other words, because the money was given to a non-legal entity, we can't follow it. Now, I thought you said just a moment ago in your testimony that fewer than half of the Afghans that CARE said they would help have actually been provided assistance, so that is fewer than half of the number they submitted. So where's the rest of the money gone?
Well, in California, CARE is involved in an all-of-society political activism approach. They have paid activists in city councils, in school boards, lobbied in the state legislature to further their extremist agenda. I cannot say with certainty that that's where the federal dollars went, but I can say that on the ground, we see the political radicalization from CARE in every aspect of California civic life.
Were they involved in any way in anti-Israel, anti-Jewish protests after October 7th that we saw all over the country?
Absolutely. CARE's leadership was present at the universities of California and the Cal State campuses, and in fact, gave sermons and speeches on those campuses.
So for all we know, the money could have gone there. I mean, my point is, and thank you for your indulgence, Mr. Chairman, we need to find out where this money has gone. This is a scandal. This is corruption. And we've got to figure out how taxpayer money has ended up in the hands of yet another organization with terrorist ties. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Senator Klobuchar.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Senator Padilla. I'd like to first extend my condolences to the family of Sarah Beckstrom. Her death is heartbreaking. She volunteered to work on Thanksgiving, and we also are praying for the recovery of Andrew Wolf. Their shooter needs to be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. But today we're talking about something else, which is the vetting process and what we can do to strengthen our system, more practical, more effective ways to both strengthen our national security while honoring, Mr. Youssefy, the service of those who served with our troops in Afghanistan. So I've led bipartisan legislation with a number of Republicans, including conservative Republicans. This has yet to pass. Over the years, we've improved it. We've added, at the request of Republicans, several provisions, but it still hasn't passed. And I think in there, and I'm happy to work with people on it, could be one of the solutions. It's an additional layer of vetting for Afghans in the U.S. who are here on a temporary basis as part of a process to adjust their status. One version of it, with several changes, was included in a bipartisan immigration bill in 2024. So I just have questions, first of all, to you, Mr. Youssefy. Sergeant, it is widely known that the motto of the Marines is Semper Fidelis, always faithful, and as I see it, you have lived up to that motto twice over, first as an interpreter for the U.S. government, and then as a U.S. Marine. What have those words meant to you? And as you remember other Afghans who also served and sacrificed alongside U.S. forces, how should the idea of being faithful apply to them?
Semper Fidelis, Madam Senator. The motto of Semper Fidelis, we know that it goes back long history in the Marine Corps, but coming up, meeting at this time, being always faithful is the people, the communities that I'm involved with in Michigan. There's like over 200 communities, which are, most of them are from 0 units, and they are proving it every day by paying their taxes, by going to their work, by sending their kids to school, by making their doctor appointments, by making sure that they live to the American standards, and they are every day doing their best to make this place home.
Thank you very much. Mr. Blackburn, thank you for your remarkable service in uniform as a Green Beret and for your dedication to helping Afghan allies. As you know, many veterans organizations, American Legion, VFW, support the bipartisan legislation that I just referenced to provide Afghans who undergo additional vetting with some kind of a pathway to permanent residency. Our bipartisan bill with several Republicans would apply the comprehensive vetting standard used in other parole status cases. And again, we're open to improving this, but it's something that has not been done in any systematic way. And you need a carrot and a stick here, and I really think that we need to look at something like this. Biometrics, in-person interviews, checks by all relevant security and intel agencies, medical screenings, and then getting conditional status. And then again, the Department of Homeland Security would have to verify. As I noted, this was part of an earlier border agreement. Can you elaborate on why American veterans have been some of the most outspoken supporter of the Afghan allies, from helping during the withdrawal to supporting resettlement to standing alongside them in their immigration hearings?
Yes, ma'am. I think earlier someone on the a senator spoke to a moral injury, and I believe that's exactly what happened when we saw the fall of in August in 2021 with our Afghan partners. And from that point, we felt the need to do something positive to affect their lives. And that's why we came together in these mesh networks to try to figure out what to do, but to do it legally. As you spoke to just now about the bill that you guys have pending, that process is what we wanted to be part of. We wanted to be part of something positive to help people that worked with us, that fought with us, that died alongside of us, and their families. And we just could not turn our back on them, even though we were going through a pretty catastrophic event at the time.
Right.
So that is why I believe veterans and myself and others have poured their life. Some of us have poured our life savings into this. I know that sounds strange.
I know you have. And it's about keeping this covenant.
Yes, ma'am.
The people that stood up for you. And I appreciate that.
The oppresso liber
Yeah.
is liberate the oppressed, and that's what we're doing.
Mr. Chairman, could I ask one more question of Mr. Hankinson? Thank you. Mr. Hankinson, the Afghan SIV program has had bipartisan support in the Senate for many years. These visas are issued for what we call faithful and valuable service to the U.S. Over the past year, even as other pathways closed, this program remained operational until recently. My legislation, I should say our bipartisan legislation, a lot of people on it, would require a strategy for improving the SIV program and making it work better, more efficient. From your experience, what process reforms would you recommend prioritizing? And have you found some vetting processes that you think would be helpful?
When I looked at the original SIV process that was used in Kabul, and this visa was expanded dramatically beyond just normal embassy employees as it was typically used for the Iraq and Afghan populations, it seemed to be pretty stringent, and I think Mr. Yousefi explained how he went through it, and, it was very careful, but the standards were dropped massively during the evacuation crisis. And then they created parole and other pathways which had none of the controls. So if ever we were to resume processing SIVs, the controls and the processes would have to go back to the way they were. So we knew who these people were. We had all of the same documentation and interviews that we had originally.
Okay, really appreciate it. Thank you, all of you.
Mr. Hankinson, I think to me, you made one of the most important points of this hearing when it comes to the challenges of vetting Afghan nationals from a war-torn country like Afghanistan, controlled by a terrorist organization like the Taliban. And that is the assumption of the federal government that no information basically meant these Afghan nationals were fine to come into the country, even though fraud is rampant, even though there may be no record because of the circumstances of that individual who don't even know their date of birth. I don't know how you actually identify in a database who a person is if you don't have some of the basic biographical information. But would you just repeat or restate your concerns about considering the absence of evidence of adequate vetting?
Thank you for the question. Indeed, I think CBP's guidance officially during the crisis when they were bringing people in the thousands was, in the absence of derogatory information, let them in. In other words, no information, we would assume, means there is no information, which is probably not true. It may be true in many cases, but when you don't have an accurate birthday, you don't have an accurate name, and you know that there are no accurate criminal records. I mean, to talk about Afghan databases, you could talk about Afghan rocket ships. There are certain things that just don't exist in the remote parts of the country, and many other countries, some of which I've served in. So vetting is only as good as the databases and the information from which you're pinging. And assuming that there's nothing there because there's no record in a U.S. database is a mistake.
And Ms. Marzouk, I wanted to get you to expand a little bit about the concerns that of funneling money to organizations like CARE. You mentioned that CARE was an unindicted co-conspirator in a 2008 case involving the Holy Land Foundation in Texas. It was involved terrorist financing and related to Hamas, a designated proxy of Iran and a terrorist group. Do you believe that that sort of funding to non-governmental organizations represents a failure of adequate and verifiable vetting?
I believe that there was a federal oversight problem after 9/11. All federal contracts were supposed to have terrorism riders to make sure that the federal money that we were handing out did not go to support terrorism. And the way that this structure was set up, the federal government gave it to the states. When the states gave that money to nonprofits, those terrorism riders were not present and there was not sufficient oversight.
So just to repeat what Senator Hawley said in his question, rhetorical question, I guess, is that we're asking an organization with ties to terrorism to vet Afghan nationals for terrorist ties. Is that correct?
That's correct. In fact, as I mentioned in my testimony, in the application in California, CARE California touted their experience with inadmissibility grounds related to terrorism. They were saying that they could coach clients how to get around terrorism screening.
And as you may know, in November 2025, Governor Abbott, the governor of my state, Texas, designated CARE and the Muslim Brotherhood as a foreign terrorist organization and transnational criminal organization. In this case, a state proclamation like this prohibits them from acquiring land in the state and authorizes heightened enforcement against affiliates. But there's also been allegations made about the promotion of things like Sharia law and exclusion of people who are not of the Muslim faith from various enclaves known in one instance as EPIC, which is a real estate development in the state. But do you have any idea whether the sort of diversion of funds to an organization like this, is that an isolated event?
I don't believe it to be isolated. I think it requires federal oversight to review all of the contracts that went from HHS to the states and then to the nonprofits, because as I explained, that money was purposefully obscured, and I believe that it is a systemic failure.
Well, of course, anybody who follows the news knows that the scandal now that's unfolding in Minnesota with regard to the Somali community and serious allegations of welfare fraud, accepting federal government funds and yet providing no services in response to those funds. Really, we don't have any way of knowing if that's just the tip of the iceberg. And so I agree with you, it bears further investigation, and I can assure you we will do that. Let me turn it over to Senator Padilla.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Echoing Senator Whitehouse's question of the first panel of witnesses, I'd like to ask this panel, who here have served in Afghanistan? Please raise your hand. Thank you. Not that it disqualifies the other witnesses from the conversation, but I do think it highlights a very, very important perspective and insight into your comments and remarks. Mr. Yousefi, I was going to ask you to speak to your motivations for having served, wanting to continue to serve, but I think you've spoken so eloquently about that already. And Mr. Blackburn, I was summarily going to ask you your perspective on what not just our withdrawal from Afghanistan, as faulty as it was in 2021, but what efforts we make to support those who served alongside U.S. service members, what signal that sends to the rest of the world. But you've already spoken eloquently about that. So my final question, well, for the two of you, is this. were patient throughout the first panel. You heard a lot of questions from both sides of the aisle here, and you participated in the second panel. Is there any issue, any topic, any question that has come up that you want to further add to a response that you think is important for us to hear that you did not get a chance to weigh in on? Mr. Yousefi first, and then Mr. Blackburn.
Thank you, Senator Padilla. The one thing that I want to bring here to the Senate is that I want to talk about it. The biggest thing is I'm heartbroken with what happened in D.C. Like I said, I lost another sister. My brother is critical injured and was in the hospital ICU. We cannot replace Sarah Beckstrom. Let me make this clear. But the only thing I want to emphasize is crime is individual. We cannot collectively punish all the Afghans, specifically and especially those who served among us, who served with us, and who are serving among us right now. Right behind me, it takes a lot of courage to come here in front of the camera when you have family back home in Afghanistan, when the Taliban are doing this to your homes and coming there and tearing apart everything. It doesn't take just a courage to come here to enlist and start the service, do 4 years active, 5 years reserve. It takes a courage to come here and be in front of the world, to watch you, to expose what's going on. We don't see this in the media. We don't see this. And I have right now over tens of National Guard and Reserve. They have T5 clearance, which is top secret clearance because they were working with Intel. Their families are stuck in Qatar. Their families are stuck in Kabul hiding. And if you Google any of our names right now, you will see we will pop up in some DVIDs or one of the websites. So the only thing that I'm asking, I came forward to talk here is because I see that we're collectively punishing by literally stopping the SIV program and not keeping our words. And these pictures do not lie.
Before turning to Mr. Blackburn, one specific question for you, Mr. Yousefi. A couple of my colleagues have raised the issue of being able to remember your birth date. I think you have a unique appreciation for what that means from an Afghan perspective. Can you comment just quickly?
Absolutely. So Afghanistan has been in a war for over 40 years. For that 40 years, how many people were educated? The educated ones will have their birthdays remembered. Because my mom, when I was born, she wrote it in her notebook because she was a physician assistant. But among all these people that were working in the U.S., they were not all interpreters. They were mechanics, they were workers, they were KBR workers that were cleaning the base, beautification, guards, so many things. Most of them did not came from educated family. They would look at you, they'd be like, all right, you look 13-year-old. Go ahead, you're 13. You have to choose your birthday.
That's helpful, very helpful. Thank you. Mr. Blackburn.
Yeah, along with that also, my first 0102, we were in host Afghanistan, and we actually, our medics would go help help with the birthing process of Afghan women. There was no certificate given, there was no identification given. It was just something that was how the world worked at that time. So I would also like to speak to vetting. As far as the touch points that we have, people like Nadeem were vetted because they worked with us. So we had a personal touch point. You had to have a personal touch point with anybody that we would recommend or helped with food and safe housing. Biometrics, it's 2025. I think we should probably figure something out with that. And then we could get away from the conversation about, particular dates. The other thing is I'm extremely proud of y'all and proud to be here with all of you guys, the entire Senate panel, to hear you guys work through this process because we've given our life to security to this country. We don't want it to stop. So whatever it takes, let's do this. We got this. We can do this, but we should not lose our humanity in the process. Mental health, we spoke about that. Y'all spoke about that quite a lot. I think it's very difficult being a soldier who does not have a mental health issue to recognize people and understand why someone does have a mental health issue, particularly with our soldiers that are committing suicide. I just don't understand it, and many of us don't. And so we wrestle with it. What I wrestle with mostly is why I can't understand it better and help them. So post-entry to the United States, I believe becomes very important for anyone that we bring here. There needs to be some level of oversight. There needs to be some level of supervision, and it's good governance to do that. And we do that in our networks. We do not leave our partners alone. We help them through the process, and I think it's very important. The other 77,000 folks that y'all are speaking to, I can't speak to that. I'm just speaking to the people that we help, like Nadeem and others. It's critical. It's what makes us different from anybody else in this world. It's our humanity and how we approach it. So thank you for that.
Thank you very, very much.
I want to express my gratitude again to each of you for your
Mr.
patience.
Chairman, may I add?
I'm sorry. I didn't see you down there. Way down there. Senator
Thank you.
Blumenthal, you have a final question?
I have a couple of quick questions. First of all, thank you all for being here. Thank you in particular, Mr. Blackburn, Mr. Yousefi, for your service to our nation. Humanity is certainly important. You're absolutely right, Mr. Blackburn, and our adherence to values and the rule of law are what distinguishes us from all the other nations in the world, in my view. They are what makes us the greatest country in the history of the world. It isn't only the example of our power, it's the power of our example that matters. And Mr. Yousefi, I was particularly struck by your testimony about your love for America before you came here, about your desire to serve in Afghanistan, and your description of what it meant to be an interpreter, not only in conveying words, but also discerning the threat environment and what was happening in terms of situational awareness. I'm very conscious of this fact, having been to Afghanistan a number of times during the conflict there, and also having a son who served in Helmand Province, who depended on his interpreter for exactly the kind of service that you provided to so many others, and then, of course, your service in the Marine Corps after you were here. And the fact that 300, at least 300 interpreters and others who served our troops have perished because of their siding with us. But even if you don't care about humanity, we should care about how our troops are served in the future when we put them in harm's way and we depend on interpreters, translators, guides, guards in those countries who put their lives on the line because we promise them that we will look out for their safety if things go south. And so I want to suggest that the presumption that vetting should be applied is absolutely right, but there should also be a presumption that we keep our promises and allow these public servants who helped our troops and diplomats to come to this country. I would like to ask you, Mr. Yousefi, how the promise to come to this country figured into your helping our troops. Did you rely on that promise?
I absolutely did. I can't say for the operation security reasons the name of my agents, special agents, and my intelligence analysts that I work with. And it wasn't for them, I would be 6 feet deep somewhere in Afghanistan right now, laying down. So this was a big change to me in my life. They gave me a new life, basically. So that's why I owe this country a lot. And that's how I feel like I will be paying back through my service to this country.
And you will continue to pay back to this country?
Absolutely. The service never stops.
And I know a lot of our Afghan allies who have come to this country. I was involved in helping many of them get out of Afghanistan, enabling some of the planes to go in when there was still chaotic disorganization. We were able to extract many of them who were in danger. And I've come to know some of them. One of them was a guest of mine at the State of the Union. And I see how they continue to give back to our great country. Members of the Afghanistan community who have come here, we are a better country, not only because of their service in Afghanistan, but also because of people like yourself who have come here to enrich and strengthen our nation in countless ways. So I want to thank you for your service. And Mr. Blackburn, you are absolutely right to call attention to the mental health issues faced by all of our veterans who may be vulnerable to them coming to this country, back to the country they love, facing the invisible wounds of war. I'm so glad you mentioned it here. I'm the ranking member on the Veterans Affairs Committee, and it's been a priority of mine to try to provide more resources and treatment for troops. And as I indicated in my first round of questions, we need to pay attention to refugees who come here, who are vetted, but are suffering PTSD, which can't be discerned necessarily in the vetting process any more than our troops can be kind of siphoned into different categories when they come back. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Blumenthal. I believe Senator Padilla has a few closing remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I thank all the witnesses, both panels, for your participation here today and for your patience. It's been a longer than most hearing for good reason. It's an important, a complex, but important topic that we've been discussing here today. A couple remarks in closing. One, earlier in the hearing, somebody made reference to, separate and apart from the SIV program, a parole program that they weren't aware that Congress had any part in creating. So for the record, parole into the country was codified by Congress in 1952. But in fact, its use preceded even that, going back to the Immigration and Nationality Act. So it's important to recognize that for the record. Second, just the topic here today, because it was portrayed differently by different members. Clearly, this was not a conversation about supporting service members and veterans or Afghan refugees, or even about public safety. Because if it was, we'd be discussing the resources that have been diverted away from those important functions and missions, away from counterterrorism, that we hope and pray are soon returned to those important missions. Instead, what we walked into was an ongoing effort by the administration and others to exploit a single attack, as heinous as it was, to justify the freezing of all asylum approvals, because that's what's happened. That's what's happening. All asylum approvals frozen despite country of origin. It's been used to justify systematically digging up of old immigration cases and the revocation of green cards. It's been used to institute new travel bans that encompass potentially 1 billion people across the globe. I call your attention to the map behind me. Legal immigration now blocked for people by this administration. It's part of a greater effort, sadly, by the administration to fearmonger and distract from its own failures and a brazen attempt to pit Americans against each other. In Boston, just last month, as immigrants lined up to take the oath of allegiance at their naturalization ceremony, think about that. Having been through the process, not just being vetted, but tested and interviewed, and finally being called for their appointment to take the oath of allegiance and become a United States citizen. After years of waiting and following the rules, officials were pulling people out of line. That's not American, to be targeting a naturalization ceremony for people on the verge of becoming citizens. And as our witnesses showed us today, it is actually patriotic to welcome those who put their lives on the line to protect our service members. Mr. Yousefi, I'm proud to call you a fellow citizen of the United States, just like I'm proud to call Mr. Blackburn a fellow citizen of the United States. So while we discussed the vetting and screening process of Afghans and we talked about keeping America safe, I can't help but observe the deflection and the distraction by the administration because their approval ratings are taking a nosedive and the MAGA coalition is fracturing. The truth is, the real issue here is so many Afghan refugees continue to struggle, not just with the trauma of war, but the frustration and anxiety of an uncertain legal future here in the United States. Fact, all too often, that frustration has led zero-unit veterans, for example, to acts of self-harm or attempts at suicide. That's devastating. That should be heartbreaking for all of us. And it's an urgent reminder of the need to invest more in life-saving mental health resources and other types of support, not less. Because what we've seen this year through budget cuts and DOGE and hiring freezes and cuts and clawbacks, et cetera, is the opposite of support for veterans and allies that have earned it. No, instead of talking about safety today, we've talked about the exploitation of a horrible incident that took place just before Thanksgiving to harm a whole class of people. But I refuse to let that happen. I'll continue to work with my colleagues to do what we should be doing and recognize and honor the bravery and sacrifices of our service members, but also our Afghan allies. And to that end, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to enter into the record a statement from more than 200 former members of the Afghan Air Force and the Afghan Special Mission Wing describing their service and asking for us to honor our promise to them.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Without belaboring the issue, I think it's just a matter of priorities. The first responsibility of the U.S. government is to protect the safety of Americans. Everything else is secondary. That doesn't diminish the contribution made by Afghan allies, but the idea that you would sacrifice the safety of American citizens in order to allow unvetted individuals to come into the country is dangerous, as Sarah Beckstrom has discovered, sadly, her family. With that, we will conclude the hearing. The record will stay open for 1 week for members to submit questions for the record. And again, thank you all for being here and for your contribution to this hearing. It's adjourned.